Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the lives of England's most fascinating queens in Part 6. Beginning with the transformative reign of Victoria and her role in shaping the Victorian era, peacefully guiding us through Britain's imperial expansion and industrial revolution, and gently arriving at the remarkable era of Elizabeth II, Britain's longest reigning monarch whose 7 decades on the throne witnessed the transformation of empire into commonwealth and the birth of the modern world. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which queen's dedication to duty inspired you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of 2 centuries of British transformation to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Victoria, later known as Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, entered this world on the 24th day of May, 1819, within the ornate chambers of Kensington Palace in London. Her mother, Princess Victoria Marie Louise of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, descended from the distinguished royal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which governed territories in what we now recognize as East Central Germany. Born as the daughter of a duke and a countess, she had previously been wedded to Charles, Prince of Leiningen, who ruled over a modest principality in present-day Bavaria in southern Germany. Following her first husband's untimely demise in 1814, she assumed the role of regent, governing on behalf of her young son Karl from her initial marriage. In 1818, Princess Victoria relinquished this significant responsibility to enter into matrimony for the second time, this union being with Prince Edward of Britain. Victoria's father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathorn, who held the distinction of being the 4th son born to the reigning King George III. Edward traced his lineage to the House of Hanover, a prestigious royal dynasty that had its origins in the northern regions of Germany, and his father simultaneously wore the crowns of both Britain and Hanover. Although King George III never journeyed to visit Hanover and spoke the English language as his mother tongue, when the couple united in marriage during 1818, Princess Victoria assumed the title of Duchess of Kent, and together they welcomed into the world a single child, whom they named Victoria. Tragically, her father succumbed to pneumonia in the year 1820, a mere 8 months following the birth of his sole offspring. Victoria's mother had brought the future sovereign into existence at precisely 14 minutes past 4 in the morning, choosing the unusual location of the dining room within Kensington Palace for this momentous occasion. This seemingly peculiar decision was actually rooted in practical considerations, as it allowed for heated water to be efficiently transported from the kitchens situated below. The birth was also remarkable for another reason. Victoria was delivered by a female physician who, by an extraordinary twist of fate, would later assist in the birth of her future husband, Prince Albert. During the moment of Victoria's arrival into this world, she occupied the 5th position in the line of succession to the British throne. She received her christening in a private ceremony conducted by Charles Manners Sutton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, on the 24th day of June, 1819, within the elegant cupola room at Kensington Palace. The baptismal ceremony bestowed upon her the names Alexandrina, Victoria Alexandrina, being chosen in honor of one of her distinguished godparents, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, while Victoria honored her beloved mother, although her official royal designation was Her Royal Highness Princess Victoria of Kent. Those who had the privilege of knowing her during her formative years consistently described her as a diligent, contemplative, and quietly earnest child, possessing characteristics that would prove invaluable when she eventually assumed the heavy responsibilities of the crown in 1837. The illustrious House of Hanover, from which Victoria proudly descended, had maintained its dominion over Britain since the year 1714. The first 2 monarchs of this Germanic dynasty, George I and George II, simultaneously held the titles of King of Great Britain and Ireland, alongside their separate designation as rulers of the German state of Hanover. However, Victoria's venerable grandfather, George III, achieved the historic distinction of becoming the first sovereign to rule over the newly formed United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Following the momentous formal union of these two kingdoms that took effect on the first day of January, 1801, the Hanoverian rulers, much like their predecessors who had governed since the transformative Glorious Revolution of 1688, functioned as constitutional monarchs, which meant they exercised limited direct authority, with the responsibility for creating legislation firmly resting in the capable hands of the democratically elected House of Commons and the aristocratic House of Lords. This system meant that Hanoverian Britain stood as a remarkable political anomaly within the broader European context, where absolute monarchies continued to dominate the continental landscape. Victoria's distinguished grandfather, King George III, had presided over periods of tremendous transformation that affected not only Britain but reverberated throughout the entire global community. Under the expansive reign of George III, the British Empire embarked upon a period of rapid and unprecedented expansion that would ultimately reach its absolute zenith during Victoria's own lengthy rule. Although this growth came with the significant cost of losing many valuable North American territories when the 13 colonies successfully achieved their independence and formed the United States of America following their decisive victory in the American War of Independence. Military conflicts across the European continent began to diminish in frequency and intensity after Britain emerged victorious from multiple devastating wars waged against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, culminating in the final defeat of the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte at the historic Battle of Waterloo. In 1815, the Hanoverian era bore witness to the remarkable phenomenon of industrialization and immense social transformation that would fundamentally reshape not only Britain, but influence the entire world. Revolutionary innovators and brilliant minds, such as the visionary engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Charles Babbage, who pioneered early computing concepts, and Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the revolutionary telephone, all emerged during this extraordinarily productive period. The roaring fires of the Industrial Revolution were continuously fed and maintained by dedicated workers, with Brunel serving as a particularly outstanding example, as throughout the early decades of the 19th century, he masterfully constructed the roads, railways, and the world's first all-iron steamship, the magnificent SS Great Britain, creating vital connections that unified Britain's rapidly expanding industrial and commercial networks. Prior to Victoria's momentous ascension to the throne in 1837, the movement of goods and people across the length and breadth of Britain relied entirely upon horse-drawn stagecoaches that traveled at the modest average speed of 12 kilometers per hour. During the transformative years of her reign, the revolutionary construction of extensive railway networks dramatically increased transportation speeds to 30 kilometers per hour by the 1830s and remarkably reached 80 kilometers per hour. By the 1850s, essential raw materials began arriving in British ports aboard powerful steamships, efficiently feeding the insatiably hungry cotton mills of the industrial North, while simultaneously bringing exotic and previously unavailable goods and foods to eager British markets. The very face of Britain underwent dramatic changes as improved agricultural techniques and increased imports supported enormous population growth, with numbers swelling from 11 million inhabitants at the century's beginning to an astounding 37 million by the conclusion of Victoria's remarkable reign in 1901. This rapidly expanding population became increasingly concentrated in urban areas, choosing to reside in the growing industrial towns where they labored diligently in the factories, mills, and mines that powered the relentless Industrial Revolution. By the conclusion of the Victorian era, Britain's towns, streets, and industrial facilities were thriving and displayed a uniform appearance due to the economical importing of standardized building materials. urban planning strategies had to rapidly evolve to accommodate the massive influx of city dwellers. And by 1900, significant improvements included the installation of proper sidewalks and reliable street lighting. Many towns and the vast majority of newly constructed homes enjoyed the modern conveniences of electricity, running water, effective drainage systems, indoor toilet facilities, and gas connections for cooking purposes. With the remarkable rise of industrial progress came increasingly urgent demands for comprehensive social transformation. Trade unions emerged as the powerful voice representing exploited workers, while dedicated campaigners began passionately advocating for meaningful political reform. Although women remained completely disenfranchised throughout this period, several significant political reforms were successfully enacted during Victoria's lengthy reign that served to open up the political process to previously excluded groups. The revolutionary concept of secret ballot voting was introduced in 1872, specifically to prevent voter intimidation and coercion, while comprehensive laws were enacted in 1883 to prevent the corrupt practice of bribing voters. However, members of Parliament continued to serve without any monetary compensation until 1911, which meant that working-class men could not realistically seek election to Parliament. Without substantial financial backing from generous donors or supportive trade unions, educational opportunities advanced considerably when, during the 1870s, the government formally assumed responsibility for providing education to children between the ages of 5 and 10. And by 1900, an impressive 90% of children regularly attended school, although children residing in rural areas were frequently withdrawn from their studies to assist with seasonal harvests. Religion also became a major topic of heated parliamentary debate during this time, particularly regarding laws that controlled what activities people could engage in on Sundays. New religious buildings continued to be constructed throughout this period, and not exclusively those belonging to the established Church of England. Catholic churches were also built as religious tolerance gradually increased across British society, yet beneath all the visible progress, remarkable innovation, and increasing prosperity, the Britain over which Victoria and her Hanoverian predecessors ruled remained a place where harsh poverty persisted. Rampant crime flourished. Excessive punishment was routinely administered. Environmental pollution spread unchecked. Prostitution was widespread. Overcrowded slums housed the desperate way, and begging was commonplace on city streets. Victoria, herself, maintained deeply conservative social views and firmly believed that individuals should remain within the social class into which they were born, never attempting to rise above their station. Victoria even vigorously opposed the concept of granting women the right to vote, dismissing the entire idea as nothing more than a mad and wicked folly that would undermine the natural order of society. During the transformative years of Victoria's reign, the mighty British Navy commanded the seas with unquestioned authority, and the vast British Empire reached the absolute pinnacle of its power and influence. The Victorian age would subsequently be remembered and celebrated by future generations as a golden era of unparalleled British greatness and global dominance. At the precise moment of Victoria's birth, it appeared highly improbable that she would ever ascend to become Queen of Britain. She occupied merely the 5th position in the line of succession to the throne. However, by the time she reached her 18th birthday, the hand of fate had dramatically intervened, and she had become the direct heir to the throne due to the unexpected successive deaths of several relatives who had preceded her in the line of succession. When Victoria first entered the world, her uncle George, who held the title of Prince of Wales, was serving as regent, governing on behalf of King George III, who was suffering from an increasingly debilitating mental illness that continued to worsen as his reign progressed toward its end. Her uncle successfully ruled as regent for 9 long years before finally ascending to the throne in 1820, officially becoming King George IV. Even following the death of the incapacitated George III, the numerous problems plaguing the British monarchy were far from being resolved. King George IV had previously contracted a secret and completely illegal marriage with the Catholic widow, Maria Ann Fitzherbert, in 1785, conducting the ceremony in complete secrecy. Any children who might have resulted from this union would not have been considered legitimate under the law. So George was eventually persuaded by government ministers to enter into a proper marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. This second marriage, though perfectly legal and approved by both the political elites and the general public, unfortunately did not result in a happy ending for either party involved. The couple managed to produce one child together, a daughter who was named Princess Charlotte, before ultimately separating amid great public scandal and controversy. King George IV had already established himself as deeply unpopular among his subjects due to his notoriously spoiled nature, his excessive greed, and his dissolute lifestyle that offended public sensibilities. Then, in the tragic year of 1817, George IV's only legitimate daughter, Princess Charlotte, died while attempting to give birth to a son who was ultimately stillborn. With this devastating loss, entire generations of potential heirs had suddenly vanished from existence, and a desperate race began among the king's unmarried brothers to produce a legitimate heir who could secure the succession. The second, oldest brother, Frederick, Duke of York, had already entered into marriage with Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia. But despite their union, the couple remained completely childless, and Frederick himself died in 1827, removing another potential line of succession. The third brother, William, Duke of Clarence, who would later become King William IV, made the difficult decision to abandon his long-term companion and instead married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, in hopes of producing legitimate heirs. Following Frederick's untimely death, William found himself next in line to inherit the throne, and any legitimate children he might father would automatically become his heirs, taking precedence over any children his younger brother, Edward, might produce. However, despite his marriage, William failed to produce any surviving legitimate offspring. Victoria's own father, Edward, Duke of Kent, occupied the position of fourth son of George III, and he quickly entered into marriage with Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria, in 1818 with the express purpose of continuing and securing the royal line of succession. The widowed Princess Victoria already had 2 children from her previous marriage. Her daughter, Princess Theodore, would eventually become Victoria's beloved half-sister and lifelong companion. Upon her birth, little Victoria assumed her place in the official order of succession, positioned behind her uncle William IV, any surviving children he might produce, and her own father. At the tender age of 8 months, Victoria's entire world was dramatically overturned when her father died suddenly and unexpectedly in January 1820, leaving the family burdened with substantial debts and placing them under the controlling influence of Sir John Conroy. Sir John Conroy was Edward's former equerry and a retired officer from the Royal Household Artillery, who claimed that Victoria's father had specifically requested that he assume responsibility for caring for his widowed wife and young child. When Victoria reached the age of 4, she began her formal education under the careful instruction of Reverend George Davies, a learned man who was described by all who knew him as patient and courteous, and who actively encouraged her to develop her natural talents and abilities. She diligently completed her daily lessons according to a strict and carefully planned schedule, demonstrating particular excellence in the study of languages, successfully learning to speak French, German, Italian, and Latin fluently. In addition to mastering the English language that she used for daily communication within her home, Victoria also greatly benefited from receiving guidance from a skilled singing instructor, the renowned opera singer Luigi Lablache, whose expertise helped develop her musical abilities. And she received comprehensive drawing lessons from the highly respected painter Richard Westile, who nurtured her artistic sensibilities and natural talent for visual expression. However, a rigorous and demanding education was not the only significant hardship that characterized Victoria's childhood years. Her daily life was strictly regulated and controlled by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, working in close collaboration with the increasingly dominant John Conroy. Victoria's mother came to rely more and more heavily on the controlling Conroy, partly due to the natural limitations of her imperfect command of the English language, which made her dependent on his guidance in navigating British society and politics. Conroy possessed tremendously ambitious personal goals and systematically exercised his growing influence over both the Duchess and young Victoria with the clear intention of ultimately controlling access to the throne itself. This strategy would have proven especially effective if Victoria were destined to ascend to the throne before reaching the age of 18, as this circumstance would legally require her mother to serve as regent, effectively placing real power in Conroy's hands. The Regency Act of 1830 had made specific legal provisions for Victoria's mother to assume the role of regent if King William IV died before Victoria reached her majority age, a governmental decision that greatly displeased William, as he harbored deep distrust and suspicion toward the Duchess and her motivations. Conroy systematically set about attempting to increase the public popularity and acceptance of the Duchess, who unfortunately remained deeply unpopular among the wider royal family and much of British society. Strict and inflexible rules were carefully established to govern every aspect of the royal household's daily operations, with particular attention paid to controlling Victoria's behavior and movements. These comprehensive regulations became widely known throughout the court as the Kensington system. As a direct result of these oppressive rules and restrictions, Victoria experienced a childhood characterized by profound isolation from normal social interactions and was deliberately kept in a state of naivety about the world beyond the palace walls. All forms of personal independence were actively discouraged and systematically suppressed, while she remained under constant and vigilant supervision throughout every moment of her day. The young princess was not even permitted to have her own private bedroom and was required to sleep on a small, uncomfortable bed positioned within her mother's room, ensuring she could never be alone. She was not even allowed the simple freedom of walking down the stairs without physically holding someone's hand, ostensibly to prevent her from falling and injuring herself. Years later, when Victoria had achieved full maturity and gained the perspective that comes with age, she would describe her childhood years at Kensington Palace as profoundly isolating and emotionally demoralizing, leaving lasting psychological scars that would influence her approach to life and relationships. Given this enforced isolation from normal childhood experiences, the young Victoria had precious few friends her own age and was largely left to entertain herself through solitary activities and pursuits. Some of Victoria's most cherished childhood hobbies and pastimes included drawing detailed pictures, writing imaginative stories, and crafting elaborate costumes for her extensive collection of dolls, which served as her primary companions. Working closely with her beloved governess, Baroness Lazan, Victoria also maintained a detailed personal diary throughout her life, ultimately producing an astounding total of over 60 million words across her lifetime, a literary output that provides historians with unparalleled insight into her thoughts, feelings, and experiences. She spent countless hours playing alone or in the company of her little dog, a King Charles Spaniel, whom she affectionately named Dash, and she even had special miniature trousers made for him, treating him as both a beloved pet and a cherished friend. When reflecting on this period of her life, Victoria would later refer to these years as among the loneliest of her entire existence, during which she had only her equally beloved governess and her faithful dog to provide companionship and emotional support. Although Victoria gradually came to resent the oppressive isolation and the restrictive rules that Conroy had created and enforced, these circumstances did, in certain unexpected ways, ultimately work to her advantage in her future role as queen. Her mother and Conroy's determined efforts to keep her emotionally weak and completely dependent on them by systematically preventing her from interacting with people they deemed undesirable, including members of her father's family and especially King William IV, who had fathered several illegitimate children and ultimately backfired spectacularly. Victoria's deliberate absence from the royal court ensured that she would never become personally associated with her deeply unpopular uncles and predecessors, George IV and William IV, both of whom had damaged the reputation of the monarchy through their scandalous behavior. Equally significant, recent archival research conducted by distinguished curators from historic royal palaces has persuasively suggested that Victoria's later bitter recollections of an unhappy and traumatic childhood may have been significantly distorted by the passage of time and her emotional state when recording these memories. Substantial evidence exists demonstrating that her mother genuinely loved her deeply and frequently spoiled Victoria with attention and gifts. Throughout her childhood, she was consistently surrounded by her devoted governess and supportive tutors who cared for her well-being. She also regularly enjoyed exciting trips to the coast for fresh air and recreation, attended theatrical performances that delighted her, and particularly loved ballet performances, which became a lifelong passion. Between 1830 and 1835, she also participated in several royal tours around the country that exposed her to different regions and peoples of her future kingdom. As an avid and talented writer, even from a young age, Victoria meticulously recorded detailed accounts of these excursions and carefully noted down her personal impressions of the country and its people. She wrote with genuine shock and concern after witnessing the environmental devastation of the Black Country in the West Midlands, an industrial region that had earned its ominous name due to the thick, choking smog produced by intensive iron-making and coal mining operations. During one of her earliest and most memorable trips, she described the landscape as utterly desolate, with coal fires burning and smoking everywhere, intermingled with rickety huts serving as workers' housing, industrial carts cluttering the roads, and ragged children visible throughout the area. Much to King William IV's considerable annoyance and growing concern, Victoria was consistently greeted with warmth and genuine enthusiasm by crowds of ordinary people at every stop during her journeys throughout the kingdom. William deeply disliked the manner in which these carefully orchestrated tours seemed to present Victoria to the public as his rival and potential replacement, rather than simply as his designated heir. And he frequently compared them to medieval royal progress's elaborate ceremonial tours, during which kings would be greeted at every town with formal ceremonies, festivals, and public celebrations. Victoria herself also developed strong negative feelings about these exhausting tours, partly due to their physically demanding nature and the constant public scrutiny they involved, and partly because she was acutely aware of King William's strong disapproval and the tension this created within the family. However, despite her personal preferences and William's objections, her mother continued to force her to participate in these public appearances. Recognizing their value in building public support for Victoria's eventual succession, in 1835, Conroy made his most audacious and aggressive attempt to solidify his permanent control over the future queen and secure his position within the royal hierarchy. During yet another demanding tour, Victoria contracted a severe fever while staying at Ramsgate, a popular seaside resort town located in southeast England. Conroy and her mother seized upon this moment of physical weakness and vulnerability to apply intense pressure on the ill princess, attempting to coerce her into officially appointing Conroy as her private secretary, a position that would grant him tremendous influence over her future reign. However, despite her illness and the intense pressure being applied by the two most powerful figures in her life, Victoria demonstrated remarkable strength of character and stubbornly resisted their demands, just as she had successfully done during all of Conroy's previous attempts to secure an official position on her personal staff. As her uncle, King William IV, finally began approaching the end of his life and reign, Victoria was increasingly viewed by both the political establishment and the general public as the nation's great hope for renewal and positive change. She gradually emerged from her years of enforced isolation and began to break free from the strict and oppressive rules imposed by her mother and Conroy, presenting herself to the world as a bright new prospect who could offer a fresh start and new direction for the British monarchy. On the momentous morning of June 20th, 1837, Victoria was awakened early at 6 o'clock to receive some unexpected visitors at Kensington Palace, who had traveled through the dawn hours bearing news of the utmost importance and urgency. She made her way downstairs and, in a highly unusual breach of protocol, met with these distinguished visitors while still wearing her dressing gown, without the formal attire typically required for such occasions. The most important among her early morning visitors was Lord Conyngham, who held the prestigious position of Lord Chamberlain and served as the most senior officer of the royal household. With great solemnity, he informed the young princess that her uncle, King William IV, had died peacefully at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. At this historic moment, Victoria officially became Queen of England, and at the age of 18, she was legally old enough to rule in her own right without requiring a regent. One of the very first decisive actions that the newly crowned Queen Victoria took was to order that her bed be immediately removed from her mother's bedroom, symbolically and practically asserting her independence and adult status. This bold move was not the only significant step she took that very day to break free from the oppressive influence that her mother and Conroy had exercised over her life for so many years. On this day of her accession to the throne, Victoria deliberately chose to dress in mourning black as a mark of respect for her deceased uncle, and she made her first public appearance as queen completely alone, confidently stepping out of her mother's long shadow and establishing herself as an independent ruler. Her first official appearance in her new role proved to be a remarkable success that exceeded all expectations. 97 distinguished counselors, cabinet ministers, and government officials arrived at the Red Saloon within Kensington Palace for their historic first meeting with Britain's new young queen, the Duke of Wellington, the legendary military hero who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. Later provided a detailed description of this momentous gathering of the Accession Council. He particularly noted that despite the new queen's notably petite physical stature, Victoria stood only 5 feet and 1 inch tall. She had not merely filled her chair during the proceedings, she had completely filled the entire room with her presence, dignity, and natural authority. Buoyed by the tremendous success of her first official appearance as monarch, Victoria immediately set about assertively establishing her independence and crafting an entirely new life for herself, free from the restrictions that had defined her childhood. She decisively fled the oppressive confinement of the Kensington system that had controlled her life and permanently left Kensington Palace itself, choosing instead to establish Buckingham Palace as her primary royal residence. She took the bold step of dismissing Conroy from all positions of influence and kept her mother at a carefully maintained distance by installing her in a remote apartment within Buckingham Palace and later providing her with a separate residence in the fashionable Belgrave Square area of London. Her beloved governess, Baroness Lezon, was warmly invited to live within Buckingham Palace itself, serving as Victoria's trusted companion and advisor during this crucial transition period. It was also around this significant time that Victoria made the symbolic decision to drop her first name, Alexandrina, and to be known solely by the name Victoria, further establishing her independence and new identity, despite her outward confidence and apparent self-assurance during public appearances. Victoria privately admitted to experiencing considerable nervousness on her coronation day, which was held with great ceremony on June 28, 1838. The elaborate coronation ceremony drew thousands upon thousands of people out onto the streets of London, all hoping to catch even a brief glimpse of their young new queen. Victoria, later, wrote extensively in her personal diary about how the sight of the enthusiastic, cheering, and waving crowds from her coronation carriage helped to calm her pre-ceremony nerves and fill her with confidence. She recorded her feelings with the memorable words, "How proud I felt to be queen of such a nation. The coronation ceremony itself, however, did not proceed entirely smoothly, as several embarrassing mishaps occurred during the proceedings. The officiating bishop fumbled his carefully rehearsed lines and prematurely called the ceremony to an end before all the required rituals had been completed. An elderly peer suffered a serious fall during the proceedings, creating a disruption, and the heavy coronation ring was mistakenly placed onto an incorrect finger, causing Victoria considerable discomfort. Despite these various mishaps and protocol violations, the jubilant public chose not to remember these minor problems, instead focusing on their celebration, which included spectacular fireworks displays and an elaborate fair held at Hyde Park, as well as free admission to theaters throughout London, as would become characteristic of many important moments throughout Victoria's lengthy reign. Great care was taken to ensure that the general public was given opportunities to observe their monarch and participate in celebrating the monarchy, helping to strengthen the bond between the crown and the people. Unlike the somewhat chaotic nature of her coronation ceremony, the first year of Victoria's actual reign passed without any serious missteps or major political crises. Her youth and deliberate distance from her deeply unpopular predecessors encouraged a rose-tinted view of her reign among both the political establishment and ordinary citizens. Many people throughout the kingdom looked forward with genuine optimism to what they hoped would be a new and more hopeful era under her enlightened rule. Victoria's petite physical size, obvious youth, limited experience in governance, and her gender as a female ruler resulted in many people significantly underestimating her capabilities and political acumen. Her status as a woman had automatically barred her from claiming the throne of Hanover, which her male predecessors had held alongside the British crown, because the ancient Salic law that governed Hanoverian succession explicitly excluded women from inheriting that particular throne. Instead, her father's deeply unpopular younger brother, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became the new King of Hanover, while also serving as Victoria's official heir until such time as she might produce children of her own. However, despite the various challenges and limitations she faced, Victoria remained absolutely determined to succeed as the sovereign monarch of Britain. Recording her firm resolve in her diary with these inspiring words, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young and perhaps in many, although not all, things inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." Victoria's initially rosy and successful first year as queen was unfortunately followed by a considerably more difficult and challenging second year, partly as a direct result of her overdependence on her favorite ministers and advisors, particularly Prime Minister Lord Melbourne of the Whig Party and her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. Victoria's heavy reliance on Melbourne and the unusually close personal relationship that developed between them caused persistent rumors to spread throughout London society that the young queen was completely under the Prime Minister's political influence. Even more scandalously, despite a significant age gap of 40 years between them, gossip suggested that they were conducting a secret romantic relationship, serious accusation that has never been proven, and likely had no basis in reality. It seems far more probable that the inexperienced Victoria simply relied heavily on Melbourne for political guidance and viewed him as something of a father figure, particularly given that Melbourne was a widower without children of his own. Many contemporary observers, including the prominent aristocrat and detailed diarist Charles Greville, noted in their writings that Melbourne appeared to be passionately fond of Victoria, in the same manner that he might have been toward a daughter, if he had been blessed with one. During the eventful year of 1839, two significant political scandals erupted that seriously threatened to permanently tarnish Victoria's previously spotless reputation and undermine public confidence in her judgment. The first crisis involved a complex court intrigue surrounding Lady Flora Hastings, who served as a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother. Malicious rumors began circulating, suggesting that Lady Flora was expecting an illegitimate child as a result. of an improper relationship with Conroy. An unusual abdominal growth that was later proven through post-mortem examination to be a large tumor on her liver provided fuel for these scandalous rumors and malicious gossip. Victoria, who continued to harbor deep resentment against both Conroy and her mother due to her restricted and controlled childhood, unfortunately chose to believe these unsubstantiated rumors and demanded that evidence be produced to either prove or disprove them. Lady Flora initially refused to submit to an intimate and humiliating medical examination, only reluctantly agreeing to such an examination in February after intense pressure was applied. The examination conclusively proved that she remained a virgin, completely refuting the scandalous allegations. The Hastings family, Conroy, and members of the opposing Tory party seized upon this incident to turn public opinion and the press against the Queen, claiming that she had maliciously spread false and damaging rumors about an innocent woman. As a result of this controversy, Victoria was actually hissed at and jeered during subsequent public appearances, marking a dramatic fall from her initial popularity to make matters considerably worse. Another serious political scandal quickly followed the first crisis, the notorious bedchamber crisis of 1839. Lord Melbourne had resigned his position as Prime Minister after both Liberal radicals and Tories voted against a controversial bill designed to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica. This bill, which had passed by only a narrow majority, would have removed political power from plantation owners who had actively resisted the abolition of slavery. A new Tory government was scheduled to be formed under the leadership of Robert Peel, but Victoria's stubborn refusal to allow Peel to appoint her ladies of the bedchamber, as was the established political custom and constitutional practice, precipitated a serious constitutional crisis. When Peel refused to govern under the unprecedented restrictions that Victoria had attempted to impose, Melbourne returned to office, and many political commentators and constitutional experts began seriously questioning Victoria's ability to fulfill her role as a constitutional monarch, a figure who should remain above and apart from the partisan politics of Parliament. When public and parliamentary support for Melbourne and his policies finally collapsed in the House of Commons in 1841, the ladies of the bedchamber, who were most closely associated with the Whig Party, were finally replaced as Robert Peel successfully became Prime Minister, bringing this constitutional crisis to a close. During the significant general election of 1841, just as the long-standing dominance of her mother and the manipulative Conroy had finally begun to wane and lose its power over her, Lord Melbourne's considerable political influence over Victoria was also destined to come to a complete end. Her next trusted confidant and chief political advisor would prove to have the greatest and most transformative impact on both her personal life and her reign as monarch: her future husband, the German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria and Prince Albert had first encountered each other during May 1836, when circumstances brought them together at court. Albert, who was also Victoria's cousin through the complex web of European royal family relationships, had been specifically invited to visit Kensington Palace by Victoria's mother. Acting under the strong encouragement and guidance of his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, a matrimonial union between the two young royals had been carefully planned and orchestrated by their respective families almost from the moment of their births, representing a calculated political alliance between royal houses. Despite King William IV's strong disapproval of the proposed match, he had expressed his desire to avoid yet another marriage alliance with the Coburg family and had openly stated his preference for Prince Alexander of the Netherlands as a more suitable suitor for his niece Victoria, and Albert had already begun developing a genuine friendship during Albert's initial visit in 1836. However, it was not until 1839 that Victoria finally decided she felt ready for the responsibilities and commitments of marriage. On November 23, 1839, Victoria formally summoned the Privy Council to gather at Buckingham Palace so that she could officially declare her intention to marry Prince Albert. She had carefully and methodically evaluated the extensive parade of eligible princes, who had been presented to her by various European courts, and had ultimately concluded that Albert was extraordinarily handsome and possessed what she described as a most delightful countenance. She had already written a heartfelt letter to Albert's uncle, King Leopold, when she was only 17 years old and before she felt emotionally ready for marriage, expressing her gratitude for the prospect of great happiness that he had helped to provide her in the person of dear Albert. She wrote that Albert possesses every quality that could be desired to render me perfectly happy, revealing the depth of her feelings for her future husband. Victoria's decision to marry Albert involved complex considerations, as romantic love could not be the sole motivating factor for a royal marriage that would have significant political implications. Although Victoria genuinely loved Albert deeply, she also decided to marry partly because she recognized her need for support in managing her overwhelming royal responsibilities, and partly because she understood that a successful marriage would help her win greater public approval and acceptance. On October 15, 1839, following royal protocol that required the Queen to propose to her chosen consort, Victoria formally proposed marriage to Albert, as established royal tradition demanded. Victoria expressed great delight and joy at Albert's acceptance of her proposal. The engaged couple embraced warmly, and Victoria later wrote with obvious happiness in her personal diary, "Oh, how I adore and love him, I cannot say." Victoria and Albert's wedding ceremony took place on February 10, 1840, and was deliberately planned as a grand public celebration that the entire nation could enjoy and participate in. This was the first royal wedding in British history that had been specifically planned with public enjoyment and participation as a primary consideration. The people of London were given the opportunity to observe Queen Victoria during an open carriage procession on her way to the marriage ceremony, which was held at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. For this momentous occasion, Victoria chose to wear a fashionable white satin court dress instead of the traditional royal robes, typically worn by monarchs. Appearing before her subjects as both a woman celebrating her marriage and as their queen, this innovative fashion choice has been copied by countless brides ever since. Establishing the white wedding dress as the standard bridal attire, she also wore a beautiful orange blossom wreath positioned over her delicate veil, a specially crafted brooch that Albert had personally made for her, and elegant earrings and necklace composed of stunning Turkish diamonds. Prince Albert appeared, equally magnificent, wearing the distinguished uniform of a British field marshal that emphasized his new role within the British establishment. Professional photographs were taken of the happy couple wearing their wedding attire, and these images were widely distributed throughout the kingdom and beyond, allowing the public to share in their joy. Victoria's wedding celebration featuring the white dress, the open carriage ride through London's streets, and the enthusiastic, cheering crowds established the template and expectations for all future royal weddings. Involving the main line of succession within the royal family, a magnificent fanfare of trumpets announced the bride's ceremonial procession into the chapel. Lord Melbourne, in his capacity as Prime Minister, led the formal procession, followed by the radiant Queen walking on the arm of her uncle, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, who had the honor of taking the place of her late father in giving her away. Victoria completely reveled in her marriage ceremony and the celebration that followed. It truly became a perfect love match that exceeded all her expectations. She wrote in her diary that her wedding day had been the happiest day of my life, capturing the pure joy and fulfillment she experienced. The newlywed couple enjoyed a brief but blissful honeymoon period before settling into married life together with great happiness and contentment. Despite Victoria's supreme status as the reigning Queen of England, both Albert and Victoria held traditional views about marriage and gender roles. They both firmly believed that in any successful marriage, a husband should naturally be the dominant partner, even when the wife happened to be the sovereign ruler of a great nation. Nevertheless, Albert quickly proved himself to be an exceptionally devoted husband, and Victoria's first pregnancy in 1840 helped to resolve some of the potential tensions created by their unusual situation. As Victoria's pregnancy progressed, and her condition became more delicate, Albert provided unwavering support, personally reading her the daily dispatches and reports from the government during times when she was not feeling well enough to get up from bed and attend to state business herself. The devoted couple worked closely together at side-by-side desks positioned within Buckingham Palace, and Albert gradually assumed the role of Victoria's private secretary in all but name, taking on an increasing number of her royal responsibilities. As she approached the end of her pregnancy and began dedicating more of her time and attention to motherhood and family life, Albert had actively encouraged Victoria to work toward improving and repairing her complicated relationship with her mother, and it was while the pregnant Victoria and Albert were traveling en route to visit the Duchess that an alarming incident occurred. 18-year-old Edward Oxford made a shocking attempt to assassinate the Queen as she passed by in her carriage during a public appearance. Oxford fired his gun twice in Victoria's direction, but fortunately, either the bullets missed their intended target completely, or, as he later claimed during his trial, the gun had not actually been loaded with live ammunition. Oxford was arrested and tried for the serious crime of high treason against the crown, but was ultimately found not guilty on the grounds of insanity. He was subsequently committed to an asylum for the mentally ill and was later deported to Australia to remove him permanently from British soil. In the immediate aftermath of this terrifying attack, Victoria's popularity among the British people actually increased significantly, and the earlier scandals involving the Hastings affair and the bedchamber crisis were largely forgotten by the public. However, this initial assassination attempt and Oxford's acquittal on grounds of insanity unfortunately encouraged additional attacks on the Queen in subsequent years, including further attempts in 1842, 1849, and 1882. Later in her life, Victoria demonstrated remarkable personal courage and bravery when, after successfully dodging another assassination attempt while riding along the Mall in London on May 29, 1842, she courageously agreed to ride out again on the following day. This brave decision was made specifically to help law enforcement officials lure the would-be assassin, John Francis, out into the open, where he could be caught in the act by plainclothes policemen who were lying in wait. However, Victoria's enduring popularity among her subjects was most firmly rooted in her role as a devoted mother and the perfect image of royal family life that she and Albert successfully created and maintained. Victoria and Albert proved to be exceptionally devoted parents who were genuinely thrilled by the arrival of their first child, Princess Victoria, who was affectionately nicknamed Vicky by the family. Their royal family grew rapidly despite the considerable difficulties and discomfort that Victoria experienced during each of her pregnancies. Their firstborn child, Vicky, was followed in succession by Albert Edward, who would later become King Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and finally Beatrice. Victoria suffered from severe postnatal depression following many of her pregnancies and particularly disliked the experience of breastfeeding, which she found both uncomfortable and undignified by the time of her 8th and 9th pregnancies. Victoria became a pioneering advocate for the use of chloroform as pain relief during childbirth, despite strong objections from members of the clergy who viewed such intervention as contrary to biblical teachings, and despite concerns from some members of the medical profession who worried about potential dangers associated with the anesthetic. The royal couple shared an intense and genuine interest in their children's development and took enormous pleasure in personally raising and educating them according to their own values and principles. They consistently presented an image of a perfectly happy family to the world, generously sharing their joy during holidays and birthday celebrations with the general public through the newly emerging illustrated newspapers that brought royal family life into homes across the nation. Albert took an unusually active and hands-on role in parenting for a man of his social class and era, spending considerable amounts of time playing with his children and actively participating in their daily care, which contrasted sharply with the typical behavior of most aristocratic fathers of the time. Victoria wrote with obvious happiness and pride in her diary about her husband's wonderful relationship with their children, recording that he is so kind to them and romps with them delightfully. Albert personally crafted joyful and memorable scenes during domestic Christmas celebrations, popularizing many festive traditions such as decorating a Christmas tree with ornaments and lights, customs that have survived and flourished in British homes to the present day. The carefully cultivated image of the happy, harmonious domestic royal family significantly enhanced Victoria's popularity among her subjects. She gradually became recognized as a powerful symbol of marital harmony and domestic bliss, widely known throughout the kingdom to be motivated by strong moral convictions and high ethical standards, characteristics that made her particularly popular with the rapidly growing and increasingly influential middle classes. Victoria's careful financial management meant that she successfully paid off her father's substantial debts and maintained a relatively modest household by royal standards, which stood in sharp contrast to the excessive and wasteful spending that had characterized her predecessors' reigns. Victoria clearly recognized that public opinion and support increased significantly when she openly devoted herself to her children and family life, and allowing Albert to assume responsibility for many of her royal duties proved to be an extremely wise political decision that strengthened both her marriage and her reign. Upon their marriage, Albert had been granted the formal title of His Royal Highness Prince Albert, but he became popularly known throughout the kingdom as His Royal Highness Prince Consort, a title that Victoria officially formalized on June 29, 1857. The remarkably effective working partnership that developed between Victoria and Albert was eloquently summarized by the perceptive observer Charles Greville in 1845, when he wrote, "They are one person, and he likes and she dislikes business," capturing the complementary nature of their relationship and their different approaches to the responsibilities of monarchy. Albert consistently aimed to create a new and powerful role for himself as Prince Consort, seeking to establish meaningful influence and authority within the British political system, recognizing a potential rival for influence over his wife. Albert diplomatically persuaded Victoria to send her longtime confidant, Baroness Lauzun, back to Germany for a quiet and comfortable retirement, effectively removing a competing source of advice and guidance. Following the death of Prime Minister Melbourne in 1842, Victoria became almost entirely dependent on political guidance and support in managing the complex demands of constitutional monarchy. Albert's wise counsel, extensive European connections, and keen intelligence proved invaluable to Victoria throughout her reign. Although she always maintained ultimate authority and took personal ownership of decisions that were particularly important to her, when the catastrophic Great Famine devastated Ireland, killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to emigrate in desperate search of survival, Victoria faced severe criticism and was bitterly denounced as the famine queen by many Irish people who felt that the British government's response was inadequate and uncaring. In January 1847, Victoria made a substantial personal donation of £2,000 from her private funds to the British Relief Association, a contribution that was worth several £1,000,000 in today's currency and represented the largest individual donation made by any single person to famine relief efforts. She also used her political influence to support the repeal of the controversial Corn Laws, which were artificially maintaining high grain prices and significantly worsening the devastating impact of the famine on the suffering Irish people. Victoria boldly chose to ignore strong Protestant opposition to her decision to support an increase in the annual grant provided by the British government to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, a deteriorating Catholic seminary located in Ireland. Unfortunately, false and malicious rumors later circulated claiming that Victoria had demonstrated cold indifference to the plight of the Irish people and that she had donated only £5 to famine relief while giving the same amount to Battersea dogs. Home on the same day. These cruel fabrications were completely untrue and unfairly damaged her reputation in Ireland. Victoria's first official visit to Ireland in 1849, which took place when the famine was finally nearing its end, was considered a diplomatic success. Although it unfortunately had no lasting positive impact on the growth of Irish nationalism or anti-British sentiment, Victoria and Albert both developed a keen interest in European affairs, with particular focus on improving diplomatic relations between Britain and France, two nations that had been enemies for much of their history. Victoria achieved the historic distinction of becoming the first British monarch to visit a French ruler since King Henry VIII had met with King Francis I of France in 1520, marking a significant step toward improved relations between the two powerful nations through Albert's family connections. Victoria was related to the French House of Orleans via the extensive Coburg family network, and she made official visits to King Louis-Philippe I in Normandy twice. First in 1843 and again in 1845, when King Louis-Philippe returned these diplomatic visits in 1844. He became the first French monarch to visit a British sovereign on British soil, representing a remarkable breakthrough in Franco-British relations. When Louis-Philippe was forced from his throne during the revolutionary upheavals that swept across Europe in 1848, he sought political asylum and safety in England, where Victoria provided him with refuge and protection. Meanwhile, political demonstrations in England, organized by the Chartists and Irish nationalists, failed to attract the widespread popular support that similar revolutionary movements were gaining throughout continental Europe, suggesting that Britain's constitutional monarchy provided greater stability and legitimacy than the absolute monarchies that were being overthrown elsewhere. Albert also assumed primary responsibility for organizing the magnificent Great Exhibition of 1851, which was carefully designed as a grand public celebration of technological innovation, industrial progress, and the expansion of international trade. Albert possessed a brilliant intellect and maintained active interests in trade, industry, art, and science, making him ideally suited to oversee this ambitious project. The Great Exhibition featured more than 100,000 fascinating exhibits from countries around the world and even displayed the famous Kohinoor diamond that had been acquired from India, showcasing the wealth and diversity of the British Empire. Because Albert possessed a strong social conscience that perhaps exceeded even his wife's, the Great Exhibition was deliberately priced to allow people from all social classes to visit and experience its wonders. The highest price season ticket cost 3 guineas, which was equivalent to over £2,000 in today's currency. But affordable day tickets were also available at the reasonable price of 1 shilling, ensuring that working-class families could afford to attend. Over 6 million people ultimately visited the Great Exhibition during its run, providing many ordinary citizens with their first exposure to the wider world beyond their immediate experience. The exhibition was widely praised and celebrated as a tremendous success that brought great pride to the nation. Victoria herself became so completely enthralled by her husband's remarkable achievement that she visited the exhibition almost every single day for 3 consecutive months, demonstrating her genuine enthusiasm and support for Albert's vision. The Great Exhibition also attracted numerous distinguished foreign admirers and visitors from across Europe and beyond. Most notably, Emperor Napoleon III of France personally invited Victoria and Albert to visit the Exposition Universelle held in Paris during August 1855, after he had earlier been received as an honored guest by the royal couple in London. During their visit to France, Victoria and Albert were treated as guests of honor at an extraordinarily lavish ball held at the magnificent Palace of Versailles, and they were given the special privilege of visiting the tomb of the legendary Napoleon I, paying their respects to one of history's most famous military leaders. Victoria and Albert also actively sought to strengthen diplomatic relations with Albert's German homeland through strategic marriage alliances and cultural exchanges. In 1858, Albert's favorite child, their firstborn daughter Vicky, was married at the young age of 17 to Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, who would eventually become Kaiser of Germany. The wedding ceremony took place on January 25, 1858, at the Royal Chapel of St. James's Palace in London. With great pomp and celebration, Albert harbored great hopes that the liberal education he had personally provided to his beloved daughter would enable her to influence Prussia and later the German Empire toward becoming a liberal constitutional monarchy based on the successful British model of government. However, Albert seriously miscalculated the political situation, significantly overestimating the strength and influence of the relatively small middle class in Prussia, while simultaneously underestimating the deep popularity and entrenchment of conservative political movements. Unfortunately, Vicky was destined not to enjoy the happy and successful life that her father had experienced when he married into the British royal family. Instead, she faced persistent criticism for what were perceived as overly British views on monarchy and government, and she encountered hostility due to her English origins and foreign influence. She was systematically ostracized by the royal House of Hohenzollern, faced opposition from conservatives at the Berlin court, and had to contend with her rising political opponent, the formidable Otto von Bismarck, who would become one of the most powerful figures in German politics. As tensions between her birth nation of Britain and her adopted country of Germany deepened over the subsequent decades, Vicky became increasingly unpopular and isolated, suffering emotionally while struggling with the demanding responsibilities of managing their 9 children. Through the marriages of their children, Victoria and Albert successfully established connections to royal families across the European continent, creating an extensive network of relationships that would influence European politics for generations. Many of the thrones of Europe, eventually, belonged to or were closely related to Victoria's 9 children and her 42 grandchildren, earning her the affectionate nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. Of the 8 grandchildren that their eldest child Vicky provided them, Princess Sophie went on to marry a Greek prince and eventually became Queen of Greece, while other family connections were established with Denmark when one of their children married into the Danish royal family, and when that couple's child later married the King of Norway, creating additional Scandinavian connections. Several important connections were formed with various German states, including through the strategic marriage of their 3rd child, Princess Alice, to Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, a significant German principality. Their daughter from this union, Alexandra, eventually married Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, creating crucial ties to the Russian imperial family. Additional connections with Russia had already been established when Victoria's 4th child, Prince Alfred, married Grand Duchess Marie, who was the daughter of Tsar Alexander II, further strengthening Anglo-Russian royal relationships. Their 5th child, Princess Helena, married Prince Frederick Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, solidifying relations with additional German territories and expanding their influence throughout Central Europe. However, their 6th child, Princess Louise, broke with royal tradition by marrying a commoner, John Douglas Sutherland Campbell, who later became the Duke of Argyll and served as a prominent member of Parliament and Governor-General of Canada. This unusual marriage actually received enthusiastic support from Victoria herself, British Prime Minister Disraeli, and the general public, as many people had grown concerned about the increasing number of German marriages within the royal family. Prince Arthur, their 7th child and a dedicated military enthusiast, rose to achieve the prestigious rank of Field Marshal in the British Army and married Princess Louise Marguerite of Prussia, continuing the family's connections to German royal houses. Their 8th child and youngest son, Prince Leopold, married Princess Helena Frederica of Waldeck and Pyrmont, representing yet another German state in the family's expanding network, although Prince Leopold died just 2 years after his happy marriage due to complications from hemophilia. a genetic blood disorder that unfortunately spread through de Sales' extensive network of descendants across Europe and caused particular suffering within the Russian royal family when the sole heir to the throne, Alexei, the son of Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra and Tsar Nicholas II, was found to suffer from this often fatal disease. Since Albert had died when their ninth and youngest child, Princess Beatrice, was only 4 years old, Victoria initially rejected any potential suitors for her daughter and insisted on keeping her close as a constant companion and source of comfort. However, at the age of 27, Beatrice finally encountered her love match when she met Prince Henry of Battenberg at a family wedding celebration. Although Victoria remained strongly opposed to this match for 8 months, expressing concern about losing her daughter's companionship, the determined couple eventually wore down her resistance through persistent appeals, and they were finally permitted to marry with Victoria's blessing, but only under the strict condition that they would continue to live in Britain and remain close to the Queen. Their daughter, Victoria Eugenie, would eventually marry into the Spanish royal family, introducing the hemophilia gene into yet another European dynasty and extending the tragic genetic legacy that had already affected so many of Victoria's descendants. On the whole, Victoria and Albert had achieved remarkable success in their ambitious goal of building extensive matrimonial connections across Europe through the strategic marriages of their 9 children and 42 grandchildren. However, their ultimate objective of achieving lasting Europe-wide peace through these family relationships failed catastrophically when the First World War erupted in 1914, even with 3 cousins occupying the rival thrones of Britain, Russia, and Germany. King George V, Tsar Nicholas II, and Kaiser Wilhelm II. The bonds of family proved insufficient to prevent the devastating conflict that would reshape the modern world. Victoria's personal life and the carefully constructed image of her happy family were completely shattered in 1861 when her mother died unexpectedly. Although their relationship had not always been perfect and had been strained by the conflicts of Victoria's childhood, the Queen felt overwhelming grief when she discovered personal papers revealing that her mother had, in fact, loved her daughter deeply throughout her life. The worst tragedy imaginable followed soon afterward when the person Victoria depended upon most for emotional support and strength, her beloved husband Albert, also died. Albert fell seriously ill with typhoid fever and died on December 14, 1861, at the tragically young age of 42, leaving Victoria completely devastated and heartbroken. Victoria was so thoroughly heartbroken by Albert's death that she never truly recovered from her grief, remaining in mourning for the rest of her life. She wrote to her uncle Leopold, expressing the depth of her despair. "My life as a happy one is ended. The world is gone for me." Her ability to fulfill her royal duties and maintain the carefully cultivated image of the royal domestic family came under serious threat during a Privy Council meeting held just 3 weeks after Albert's death, when Victoria was so overwhelmed by grief that she found herself completely unable to speak. Consumed by profound and debilitating grief, Victoria chose to wear mourning black clothing and minimal jewelry for the remainder of her life, withdrawing almost completely from public appearances and engagements, a decision that proved disastrous for her public image and relationship with her subjects. Her severe depression caused her to gain significant weight, which further discouraged her from making public appearances and increased her desire for isolation. She became increasingly lonely and attempted to compensate for Albert's loss by obsessively controlling her children's time and maintaining an almost shrine-like preservation of their father's memory throughout the royal residences. Victoria's self-imposed seclusion led many people to assume that she had become incapable of effectively performing her duties as monarch, and she lost much of her confidence. Avoiding all public appearances except for the most essential official government functions, she retreated behind the protective walls of her favorite royal residences, including Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Windsor Castle, emerging only when absolutely necessary for state business. The British public gradually began to lose respect for their reclusive queen, and some radical voices even began calling for the complete abolition of the monarchy, viewing it as an expensive and useless institution. Several doctors who were called to examine Victoria during this period privately expressed fears that she might be suffering from serious mental illness similar to that which had afflicted her grandfather, King George III. Victoria remained in this self-imposed isolation until the early 1880s, when her family members, particularly her uncle Leopold, trusted confidants, and Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli finally succeeded in convincing her to gradually return to public life under their persistent encouragement and gentle pressure. Victoria eventually agreed to visit the gardens of the Royal Horticultural Society at Kensington and to take a carefully planned drive through London in an open carriage, allowing the public to see their queen once again. However, it was really two remarkable men, John Brown and Abdul Karim, who ultimately succeeded in drawing Victoria out of her overwhelming grief sufficiently to fully repair her public image and re-engage with the political sphere. John Brown was a plain-speaking Scottish Highlander who served as Victoria's personal manservant and gradually became one of her most trusted and valued companions. In 1864, Victoria described his constant presence and unwavering loyalty as a real comfort during her darkest hours of grief and mourning. However, not everyone approved of Brown's extraordinary influence over the Queen. Members of the press frequently suggested that the two had secretly married, and Brown became deeply unpopular within the royal household staff, a fact that did not dissuade Victoria in the slightest from maintaining their close relationship. Brown provided crucial help in enabling Victoria to cope with her profound grief and treated her as a woman and human being, rather than simply as a monarch, offering the kind of honest, straightforward companionship that she desperately needed during this difficult period. In 1866, Victoria took her first tentative steps back into the political sphere, attending the state opening of Parliament for the first time since Albert's death and openly supporting the Reform Act of 1867, which significantly extended voting rights to many urban working men throughout the kingdom. The second of Victoria's important confidants proved to be even more controversial and unpopular with the court establishment than John Brown had been. Abdul Karim served as Victoria's personal servant and munshi, or teacher, having come to her service from India. From 1887 until the end of her life, Karim attracted considerable prejudice and jealousy from court officials, perhaps even more than Brown had experienced due to widespread ideas about racial superiority that were common during this period, and because of his relatively humble social background. However, as she had done with Brown, Victoria completely ignored the advice and jealous complaints of others. Regarding her relationship with Karim, under Karim's patient and skilled instruction, Victoria learned to speak the Urdu language fluently and developed a deep fascination with Indian culture, history, and traditions. Victoria's detailed notes from her language lessons with Karim still survive today in the royal archives, along with many of her other extensive writings, providing valuable insight into this important relationship. During the latter portion of her reign, the Queen became increasingly interested in the vast British Empire and devoted considerable time and energy to promoting its continued expansion and glorification as a force for civilization and progress throughout the world. By the end of Victoria's remarkable reign, the British Empire covered more than 1/5 of the world's total landmass and included nearly 1 in 4 people on Earth, encompassing the entire Indian subcontinent as well as large portions of Africa, numerous Caribbean islands, and territories on every continent. Between 1815 and 1914, approximately 400 million people and 10 million square miles were added to the empire, with the vast majority of this expansion occurring during Victoria's lengthy reign, making her the sovereign of the largest empire in human history. The military conflicts of Victoria's era were typically fought on distant shores far from Britain itself, with the notable exception being the Crimean War, which was fought against Russia from 1854 to 1856 in what is now Ukraine. It was during the Crimean War that the first Victoria Cross medals were awarded, establishing the first official honor specifically granted to ordinary servicemen in recognition of exceptional bravery and heroism in battle. The British Army and Royal Navy found themselves involved in military conflicts in Afghanistan, China, India, Ghana against the Ashanti people, in Eastern and Southern Africa against the Zulu nation, Egypt, and in South Africa against the Dutch settlers known as Boers. Victoria was not naive about the human and financial costs of maintaining and expanding the empire. She actively supported expansionist policies and strongly approved of Prime Minister Disraeli's aggressive expansionist foreign policy. She once wrote, "If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, we must be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other," demonstrating her realistic understanding of the military commitments required to maintain global dominance. Victoria viewed the expansion of the British Empire as essential for spreading civilization and protecting native peoples from what she perceived as aggressive and oppressive local rulers who might exploit or harm their subjects. On May 1, 1876, Victoria was formally crowned Empress of India in a magnificent ceremony, receiving this prestigious title through a parliamentary vote, although she had been actively interested and involved in Indian affairs long before this official recognition during the 1840s. Victoria had registered her strong disapproval and disgust at the behavior of the East India Company, a semi-private commercial corporation that effectively governed British territories in India while generating enormous profits from trade throughout the region. In 1856, she wrote compassionately, "I always feel sorry for those poor deposed Indian princes," expressing sympathy for the local rulers who had been removed from power by British expansion. Victoria had actually met one of the men who had been deposed by British forces, Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, who had been removed from power by the British in 1848 and was subsequently invited to meet Victoria and Albert in 1854 after his conversion to Christianity. Despite his later attempt to return to Lahore and reclaim his throne, Duleep Singh was eventually reconciled with Victoria in 1890, when she granted him a full royal pardon for his past actions. Victoria would later become the godmother to Singh's daughter, Princess Sophia Alexandrovna Duleep Singh, who grew up to become a prominent English suffragette and campaigned passionately for women's rights outside Hampton Court Palace, where Victoria had graciously allowed her family to live. Despite her deep interest in India, her mastery of the Urdu language, and her close friendship with Abdul Karim, Victoria never actually visited the Indian subcontinent during her lifetime, remaining in Europe throughout her reign. In addition to her formal investiture as Empress of India, Victoria's public popularity was dramatically restored through the extravagant celebrations surrounding her Golden Jubilee in 1887, marking 50 years of her rule, and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, celebrating an unprecedented 60 years on the throne. Her public appearances during these celebrations caused tremendous excitement throughout the kingdom, and her rare open smile as she processed through London in an open carriage during her Golden Jubilee was one of the very few moments when Victoria's genuine happiness was captured by photographers. However, Victoria never forgot her private grief even during these moments of public celebration, writing poignantly on the day of her Golden Jubilee, "The day has come and I am alone," reflecting on Albert's absence during this triumph. By 1897, Victoria's popularity and personal confidence were completely restored, and she had become widely regarded as the nation's beloved grandmother figure, receiving thousands of congratulatory messages for her Diamond Jubilee from admirers. Across the world, she responded to this overwhelming outpouring of affection by sending a heartfelt telegraph message of thanks to her subjects. "From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them." This tremendous display of national pride and international recognition led to the entire era being known simply as Victorian Britain, with her name becoming synonymous with the age itself. The relative lack of major, expensive wars during her reign, especially in comparison with the decades that followed, combined with the enormous new wealth generated by industrial innovation and expanding international trade, resulted in the emergence of a much larger and more affluent middle and upper class population that could afford to spend money on leisure activities and cultural pursuits. Public parks began opening in towns across the country, with the first municipal park opening in Preston, Lancashire, and organized sports clubs for cricket, football, rugby, and athletics were established in communities throughout the kingdom. Music halls, theaters, public readings, and comic operas became increasingly popular forms of entertainment, while new museums opened their doors to educate and inspire the public, including the Victoria and Albert Museum, which opened in 1852 and bore the names of the royal couple, for those fortunate enough not to be living in poverty. The Victorian age truly represented a golden period of prosperity, cultural achievement, and social progress that improved the quality of life for millions of people. By 1901, at the advanced age of 81, Victoria was becoming increasingly frail and had lost significant weight, requiring the use of a wheelchair to move around her residences. She chose to spend her final months at Osborne House on the peaceful Isle of Wight, seeking tranquility and privacy while avoiding the public spotlight that had defined so much of her life. The few people who had the privilege of seeing her during this final period reported that she seemed to have physically shrunk to half the person she had once been, appearing fragile and diminished. Victoria suffered from painful osteoarthritis, a degenerative condition that made her joints extremely stiff and caused her considerable discomfort. And her surviving dresses from this period had to be specially altered to accommodate a dowager's hump, a pronounced curvature of her upper back caused by spinal collapse. The final year of Victoria's life had been particularly difficult and filled with personal losses that deeply affected her spirit and will to live. She had endured the devastating experience of witnessing the death of her second son, Alfred, in July 1900, who had succumbed to the combined effects of his own son's suicide, the complete breakdown of his marriage, and his increasing dependence on alcohol. Her beloved grandson, Christian Victor, who was the son of her daughter Beatrice, died in October 1900 from malaria contracted during military service, along with his father, creating another profound loss for the aging queen. The accumulated sorrow and grief perhaps hastened Victoria's own death, as her close companions noted that not only her physical stature but also her indomitable spirit seemed to be diminishing, and she gradually lost her appetite and interest in the world around her. Despite being nearly blind in her final months, Victoria demonstrated her lifelong dedication to duty by continuing to write entries in her personal diary until her very last entry on January 13, 1901, when her strength finally began to leave her completely. Her devoted family gathered around her bedside as her death approached, joining her son and designated successor, Edward VII, in maintaining a loving vigil. Queen Victoria died peacefully on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81, passing away in her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II's arms while surrounded by her family at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She had ruled for almost 64 years, establishing the record as the longest-reigning British monarch up to that point in history, a record that would not be surpassed until her great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, exceeded it in 2015, in accordance with the Queen's specific wishes. Her body was dressed in a white dress and her treasured wedding veil before being transported back to London for the state funeral. Her funeral procession moved slowly through streets lined with countless mourners on its way to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where the formal funeral service was conducted with appropriate dignity and ceremony. Her eldest son, now King Edward VII, walked solemnly behind her coffin, accompanied by her third son, Prince Arthur, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had traveled from Germany to pay his final respects. Victoria's funeral was deliberately kept simple and respectful, exactly as she had specifically requested during her lifetime, reflecting her preference for dignity over ostentation. Following the service, Victoria was laid to rest beside her beloved husband Albert at the royal mausoleum located near Frogmore House within the grounds of Windsor Castle, finally reuniting the devoted couple who had been separated by death for nearly 40 years. Before her burial, Victoria had requested that certain personal items be placed with her in the coffin, including treasured pieces of jewelry, plaster casts of her children's hands made during their youth, and Albert's dressing gown, which still carried his scent and provided her comfort, in a final gesture that demonstrated the complexity of her relationships. Victoria had also secretly requested that her trusted royal physician add a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair to her left hand, ensuring that this important friendship would accompany her into eternity despite the controversy it had caused during her lifetime. Above the entrance to the mausoleum, Victoria's own words were inscribed in stone as her final message: "Farewell, best beloved. Here at last I shall rest with thee. With thee in Christ I shall rise again," expressing her deep faith and her joy at being reunited with Albert in death. Victoria was the last British monarch to belong to the House of Hanover and was succeeded by her son Edward VII, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on January 22, 1901, beginning a new chapter in the history of the British monarchy throughout her life. Victoria never believed that she, as a woman, represented the ideal choice to serve as monarch of a great nation. She consistently held the view, shared by many of her contemporaries, that men were naturally better suited to serve as political and military leaders. However, by the time of her Diamond Jubilee celebration in 1897, no one in the kingdom, not even Victoria herself, could seriously doubt that a woman was fully capable of serving effectively as a constitutional monarch, despite experiencing several years of significant unpopularity when she became a reclusive widow following Albert's death. Victoria ultimately became immensely popular among her subjects, particularly during the 1880s and 1890s when she returned to public life. To many of her subjects, she appeared to be a benevolent, matriarchal figure who stood above the petty partisan politics of the day, providing stability and continuity during a period of rapid social and economic change. Only after Victoria's death, and the subsequent release of her extensive diaries and personal correspondence, did historians and the general public begin to understand the true extent of her deep political influence and involvement in governmental affairs. Throughout her reign, although she was constitutionally constrained by the limitations of constitutional monarchy, Victoria skillfully took full advantage of her recognized rights: the right to be consulted on important matters, the right to encourage specific policies and actions, and the right to warn against potential mistakes or dangers, as the distinguished constitutional theorist Sir Walter Bagehot observed in his analysis of her reign. Victoria had on more than one occasion successfully altered the direction of government policies and influenced the behavior of politicians through the strategic exercise of her considerable influence and authority. Despite her frequent expressions of self-doubt and lack of confidence, Victoria had proven herself to be a remarkably skilled politician who successfully presented herself to the public as a devoted wife and mother, characteristics that home-loving Victorians could easily identify with and admire, while maintaining strict standards of personal morality that set an example for the entire nation. Victoria brought much-needed stability to a monarchy that had been severely damaged by a series of unreliable and frequently unpopular kings who had preceded her to the throne. She successfully made the monarchy more accessible and relatable to ordinary people through various innovations, including opening her birthplace, Kensington Palace, 2 public tours in 1899, establishing the public-oriented style that would characterize future royal weddings, and making frequent public appearances, such as her highly publicized visits to the Great Exhibition. Victoria's extraordinary reign guided Britain through a tumultuous period of industrial, economic, technological, and social transformation that fundamentally changed not only British society, but influenced the entire world. She had successfully overseen massive territorial expansion abroad, while maintaining political stability and economic growth at home, and her reign was fondly remembered by the Victorians and their descendants as a golden age of unparalleled British greatness and global influence. However, in more recent times, Victoria's legacy and the legacy of her era have become increasingly controversial and subject to critical examination as historians have begun to evaluate more carefully the human costs of industrial progress and imperial expansion. The experiences and perspectives of non-British subjects within the empire and the suffering of the poor within Britain itself are now being included in historical narratives of the Victorian age, providing a more complete and nuanced understanding of this complex period. Victoria's formal investiture as Empress of India and her central role as the symbolic leader of the British Empire significantly complicate her historical legacy and raise important questions about the impact of British imperialism on colonized peoples. Victoria and Albert's sincere intention to promote lasting peace throughout Europe by establishing an extensive network of family alliances through strategic royal marriages ultimately represented a spectacular failure of diplomacy. Although Victoria became affectionately known as the grandmother of Europe and had successfully arranged marriages for her 9 children and 42 grandchildren into numerous European royal houses, these family connections proved completely inadequate to prevent the outbreak of war. By the beginning of the 20th century, Victoria's direct descendants occupied the thrones of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Romania, and Spain, creating an unprecedented network of royal relationships across the continent. However, Victoria's idealistic vision of a peaceful Europe united by family bonds was destined never to be realized, as her own grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, would ultimately lead Germany into the devastating First World War against Britain in 1914, demonstrating that political and economic interests could override even the closest family relationships when national survival was at stake. Among Victoria's most notable descendants, the 3 royal cousins Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain have often been blamed by historians for their collective failure to prevent the outbreak of the First World War through diplomatic means, suggesting that family connections alone were insufficient to maintain international peace. Nevertheless, Victoria and Albert's remarkable legacy continues to live on today, as their living descendants still occupy several European thrones and continue to play important roles in international diplomacy and cultural exchange. From her direct connections to present-day monarchs to the detailed study of the Victorian era that British children encounter in their school curriculum, Victoria's influence and memory endure as a permanent part of British national identity and historical consciousness. The popular image of Victoria as a stern, elderly lady permanently clad in black mourning attire has defined public perception of her for more than a century. But contemporary historians are working to develop a more complex, nuanced, and complete understanding of both Victoria as an individual and the era that bears her name, revealing the extraordinary complexity and contradictions that characterized both the woman and her age. Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest reigning monarch documentary. Elizabeth, later known as Queen Elizabeth II and Britain's longest reigning monarch, entered this world in London on April 21, 1926. Her father was Prince Albert of York, affectionately known to his family and close friends as Bertie. Her mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, for whom Elizabeth was the firstborn child. She received the name Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. But despite the fact that her regnal name became Elizabeth II, she was not named for the legendary Queen Elizabeth. Rather, she was named for her mother, for her paternal great-grandmother, Queen Alexandra, and for her grandmother, Queen Mary. Elizabeth II was named for women who were consorts rather than those in whom supreme authority was vested, and few imagined that she would mature to do much more than Mary. bear children, and enjoy a life of quiet aristocratic privilege. As the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, Elizabeth's birth was joyfully welcomed, but the family had little expectation of the grand status which would one day be hers. Her father, Prince Albert of York, was not the Prince of Wales, an heir to the throne of Britain, but rather was the second son of King George V, who had been sovereign of Britain and Emperor of India since 1910. Bertie's older brother, Prince Edward, who was called David within the family, was next in line to inherit the throne. David was not yet married, but he was just 32, only 18 months older than Bertie. He had not married by the time Elizabeth was born, but most people were of the opinion that the Prince of Wales still had plenty of time to marry, have children, and secure the royal line in this way. Thus, few people would have imagined when she was born in the spring of 1926 that Princess Elizabeth of York would one day be queen, even though she was the third grandchild of King George V and Queen Mary. Elizabeth's birth was accompanied by great excitement, as she was theoretically the third in line to the throne. For most of the day, a crowd of reporters and well-wishers stood outside the house at 17 Bruton Street, where the Duchess of York had given birth, hoping for a glimpse of the members of the royal family coming and going to meet the newborn princess. King George V and Queen Mary were among the first to pay a visit to 17 Bruton Street that very day, eager to meet their first granddaughter. The Queen pronounced her a little darling with a lovely complexion and pretty, fair hair, while the King was equally taken with his newest grandchild. Elizabeth became a great favorite, not only with the British newspapers and magazines who christened her Princess Betty, but also with the senior members of the royal family. The Duke and Duchess of York were periodically busy with royal duties and functions, and Elizabeth therefore spent a sizable proportion of her childhood being cared for by her nannies and governess. A typical scenario for royal children in times gone by. However, her parents also placed great importance on their family life and made sure that they had daily quality time with their daughter for at least an hour every morning and every evening between tea time and bedtime. Neither did Elizabeth lack any family for company when her parents were away. She either stayed with the King and Queen at Sandringham or Balmoral, or with her maternal grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, or at their London house at 17 Bruton Street, where she had been born. While Bertie and Elizabeth were away on a royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1927, they missed their daughter's first word. The Princess Nanny, Clara Knight, reportedly helped her learn to pronounce the word mummy, although amusingly, Elizabeth used the title on multiple individuals before her mother's return. The Duke and Duchess of York were openly overjoyed at being reunited with their daughter, if not a little dismayed at how much she had grown and changed in the months that they had been away. Still, they knew she was well cared for in their absence, and it was generally not the practice for small children to accompany royals during extended travel. Elizabeth's uncle David also showed her much affection. He visited her often during her childhood, bringing her gifts and chatting amusedly with his little niece. King George V doted on her and would willingly play any part in her games. On one occasion, one of the king's equerries or attendants was shocked to find the king on his hands and knees pretending to be a horse, and allowing the two-year-old princess to lead him around by his beard. Elizabeth called him Grandpa England, which amused him greatly, as did his granddaughter's inability to pronounce her own name as a toddler. Lilibet was the best she could do, and the king made sure that the nickname stuck. Lilibet had what many observers and historians characterize as an idyllic childhood. Soon after her birth, the Duke and Duchess of York moved into a house at 145 Piccadilly in London. Elizabeth spent most of her days with her nanny, Mrs. Knight, and her nurses, Ruby MacDonald, and her sister Margaret MacDonald, whom Elizabeth called Bobo. She enjoyed regular and daily quality time with her parents, who believed in the importance of a close, warm, and fun-filled family life. Elizabeth's favorite activities were playing with her toy ponies and working in the garden with her father. Her love of the outdoors became apparent very early on, while she also shared a love of animals with other members of the family, particularly horses and dogs. Bertie had no less than 8 pet dogs during Elizabeth's childhood, including 3 corgis, which famously became the Queen's favorite breed, ones she kept several of down to her last years. Elizabeth's grandfather, George V, shared her love of horses and gifted her with her first pony for her 4th birthday, a Shetland named Peggy. Elizabeth began taking riding lessons the following year, eventually proving to be an impressively adept equestrienne and as incurably horse-mad as most of the royal family. Lilibet, who loved to be outdoors getting dirty, once remarked that she hoped she might marry a farmer so that she might spend every day outdoors with horses and dogs. During the summer of 1930, Elizabeth, Duchess of York, gave birth to her second daughter and last child at her family's ancestral home at Glamis Castle in Scotland. She and Bertie named the infant princess Margaret Rose. Lilibet was delighted with her baby sister. She wrote to a relative that at first she thought that Margaret was some kind of wonderful dolly, only to discover that she was alive. The next few years were relaxed and happy ones for the family. Bertie and Elizabeth referred to their family affectionately as us four, a surprisingly close relationship for a royal family unit. Bertie's relationship with his own parents, by way of contrast, had been comparatively cold and distant, and Elizabeth might be said to have been the first monarch raised in a relatively modern manner. In 1931, the king gifted the Yorks with Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. After extensive renovation and redecoration, the family used the house as a weekend retreat. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became particularly attached to the Royal Lodge, and it remained her primary residence for 50 years. Following her husband's passing in 1952, the Yorks had some of their happiest times together as a family at Royal Lodge. In the early to mid-1930s, for Elizabeth and Margaret, the days usually began with chatter and hijinks in their parents' bedroom before breakfast. The girls would spend the bulk of the day either playing outdoors or in the nursery with Ruby, Bobo, and Mrs. Knight, whom they called Alla, or attending to their lessons with their governess, Marion Crawford, whom they called Croffy. There would usually be more family fun time in the late afternoon or early evening. Between tea time and bedtime, Bertie, Elizabeth, and their daughters became beloved by the British press and the public quite early on. They seemed to project an almost bourgeois domestic contentment that ordinary people admired and with which they could identify. This national perception of their family's character as loving, stable, and relatable would come to be exceptionally important later on when Bertie was called upon to ascend to the throne. Like so many siblings who are close in age, Elizabeth and Margaret developed very different personalities. Elizabeth was reserved, conscientious, and dutiful. Adults who met her were impressed by her quiet dignity and composure from a young age. She was efficient and tidy, carefully arranging her shoes outside the nursery door and lining up all of her toy ponies in a neat row each night before bed. That being said, she also had a sense of humor and fun that were no doubt enhanced by having her sister Margaret as a nursery companion. Whereas Elizabeth was reserved, Margaret was openly affectionate. While her sister was practical and dutiful, Margaret was romantic, imaginative, and often mischievous. There were the inevitable struggles between them as young children. Margaret had a tendency to bite when she was incensed with Elizabeth, who, equally incensed, would hit her back. Elizabeth expressed annoyance that Margaret seemed always to want whatever she wanted. Margaret was also given to teasing, which aggravated Elizabeth, who had a short temper when they were children. But at the same time, she was enormously protective of her younger sister, conscientious about keeping talk of unpleasant or frightening things to a minimum in front of her, and mindful to include Margaret as much as possible. Their relationship would eventually be complicated and strained by the family's proximity to the crown, but nonetheless, throughout their lives, the two sisters remained close and loving confidants. Compared to the royal court, where the monarch was head of the church, The York household was a much more secular space. For most of her life, Queen Elizabeth II cherished a deep religious faith and took her position as the head of the church very seriously. But during her childhood, her parents placed far more emphasis on kindness, consideration, order, and good manners than on religious devotion. Holidays meant large family gatherings. And Elizabeth and Margaret enjoyed summers in Scotland and Christmases and Easters at Sandringham. In Norfolk, they received a weekly allowance of 1 shilling each, and Elizabeth saved most of hers throughout the year to buy Christmas presents for her family. Small gifts rather than extravagant ones were preferred, and the royal family still observes this tradition of simple gift-giving today, even after Elizabeth's passing, even in her later years. The Queen enjoyed the white elephant or gag gifts most of all. A recent biography noted a bit of whimsy that sat on a corner of the Queen's bathtub. A crowned rubber duck, a gift from one of her grandchildren. During childhood Christmases at Sandringham, Elizabeth and Margaret often received books, dolls, toy horses, and sweets. Elizabeth kept a careful list of gifts she had received and who had given them to her, making sure to send a thank you note to each one. She also carefully smoothed out and saved the wrapping paper to be reused later, as wrapping paper was something of a luxury item in 1930s Britain. Marion Crawford, or Crawfie as she was known, Elizabeth and Margaret's governess, seemed to think that the two girls lived isolated and lonely lives. She later wrote of her concern that the princesses did not have the lostness of the real or experience nearly enough of the real world. She wanted to take them on many more excursions than were permitted, to ride the tube or the London subway, to play in a public park, to meet and mix with ordinary children. However, such excursions were difficult to undertake due to the media attention that might ensue. The York princesses were simply too recognizable to the London public. It is interesting that Crawfie did not reflect on the fact that Elizabeth and Margaret actually did spend time with ordinary people all the time. In fact, they spent the bulk of their time with Ruby, Bobo, Mrs. Knight, and Crawfie herself, all of whom came from working-class backgrounds. In light of this, it seems doubtful that the girls could have failed to absorb something of their sensibilities, values, and beliefs. It had been Mrs. Knight who had taught Elizabeth to save her used wrapping paper, to be conscious of waste and ostentation. It was to Bobo and Crawfie that Elizabeth would constantly turn, either to share her joys or her worries. Some observers and historians disagree with Marion Crawford's perception of the princesses as lonely and isolated. While they concede that the girls generally did not get many opportunities to meet ordinary children, they point out that they were permitted to play with plenty of children from their own set. This included the children of extended family members and children of the aristocracy. And while Crawfie's descriptions of the princesses portrayed them as mostly down-to-earth, other writers have emphasized that Elizabeth and Margaret were ultimately never in doubt of their status. They were, after all, curtsied to by almost everyone after their father became king. And, as many children do when they believe they can get away with it, they sometimes did not hesitate to remind their playmates of their right to get their own way. As close-knit as the family was, their social dynamics could be as complex as those of any other family. Margaret's outgoing and affectionate nature resulted in a close relationship with her parents that Elizabeth might have envied. Additionally, as the elder daughter, the expectations of Elizabeth were higher, and became increasingly so as the family's proximity to the throne shifted in the ensuing years. On the other hand, Elizabeth had a stronger affinity with other members of the royal family as a child, including her grandparents, King George V and Queen Mary, than Margaret did. The sensible and pragmatic Queen Mary felt a special kinship to her eldest granddaughter, whose personality and outlook on life strongly resembled her own. Members of the family were often impatient with Margaret, seeing her as having a difficult character, distrusting her conspicuous high-spiritedness, her frankness, and her passion. Reserved, neat, practical, and dignified, Elizabeth had more in common with her grandparents. despite the difficult dynamics that seemed to afflict all families. Elizabeth and Margaret had a relatively happy childhood, and a surprisingly quiet, slow, and predictable one considering their status as royals. The fact that Elizabeth, nor those around her, ever expected her to be the Queen of Britain is evident from the approach to her education. With Crofty, she and Margaret studied English literature and history. In subsequent years, they received regular lessons from a French instructor, but this was largely the extent of their formal academic training in their earlier years. King George V was opposed to the idea of the princesses attending school, and his sons David and Bertie agreed. They believed there were too many public relations pitfalls involved. For example, which school should they choose, and how could they avoid offending other educational institutions? How could the princesses pursue a normal education while being constantly singled out and scrutinized? Additionally, Bertie remembered his own awkward and painful experiences of being bullied at school, of being pressured to succeed, and he was eager to give his daughters an easier, more carefree childhood and to keep them sheltered as long as possible. Although one can readily understand his protective impulse, Bertie almost certainly underestimated his daughters. Even as young girls, they were far more confident and self-possessed than Bertie had been at their age, and both might have benefited greatly from being able to attend school and receive a more varied and challenging education. There was, at the time, however, a significant amount of social pressure not to educate aristocratic women to be scholars or intellectuals. One did not want to be labeled a bluestocking, a derogatory term for an educated woman who ought to prefer a more traditional female role. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was initially in favor of sending the girls to school, but ultimately came to agree with the other senior royals. After all, she herself had also been educated at home by a governess. Throughout each week, the princesses attended to their lessons daily, but usually did not study for more than 2 or 3 hours. Additionally, the Duke and Duchess of York often thought little of interrupting schoolroom activities in favor of family fun time, a habit that worried the princess's governess. Crofty privately believed that Elizabeth and Margaret should have a more rigorous education, but her position in service to the royal family did not permit her to criticize Bertie and Elizabeth's approach to educating their children. Crofty managed to discreetly bring the matter to the attention of Queen Mary, who heartily agreed that her granddaughters should have the most varied education possible, even if under informal circumstances. Queen Mary began to take the girls on regular outings herself to museums, galleries, and historic sites. In addition to their studies in the schoolroom, Elizabeth and Margaret received piano, voice, and dance lessons. The naturally charismatic Margaret proved to be especially talented in the performative arts. She was a natural mimic with a facility for accents, had a lovely singing voice, and a hilarious knack for comic timing. Famed writer and performer Noel Coward once observed that had Princess Margaret been permitted to pursue a career in the theater, she undoubtedly would have been an enormous success. Elizabeth could play piano decently enough, but she was far less interested in the arts than Margaret. Interestingly, the sisters also got the chance to learn and practice domestic arts. They had a child-sized cottage playhouse on the grounds of their weekend retreat at Royal Lodge, a gift to the princesses from the people of Wales. Everything was in miniature, but the little house was stocked with every convenience, including hot running water and modern appliances, and even a wireless set. The girls loved their cottage, and the British public was charmed by descriptions of the York princesses learning to cook and keep house. A down-to-earth and inspiring image of royalty in Depression-era Britain. In January 1936, when Elizabeth was 9 years old, her seemingly idyllic and carefree childhood came to an end when her grandfather, King George V, died. Elizabeth was deeply saddened by his loss, but, as Crofty later wrote admiringly, she seemed determined to go through it all without making any fuss. On the day of George V's funeral, while watching the king's body being loaded onto a train at Paddington Station, Elizabeth stood silently while dozens in the crowd openly wept. The year following the king's death was a strange one for Elizabeth and Margaret and for their parents. There had been fewer and fewer visits from Uncle David in the last few years. And now they stopped altogether, now that he had automatically ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. Edward's conduct, both before and after he became king, was troubling to most members of the royal and parliamentary establishment. Such matters were almost certainly never discussed in front of Elizabeth. But she could probably sense the tension within her own family. Most of the new king's romantic entanglements in recent years tended to be with married or divorced women, which complicated his new status as head of the Church of England. Divorce was largely forbidden by the Church, except in very select cases of neglect, abuse, or infidelity. Even in these cases, couples were still encouraged to try to work it out or come to some arrangement. Because Edward was destined to become the head of the Church, which frowned to such an extent on divorce. His relationships in the past had been controversial, but Edward's most recent relationship, and the one which he was still involved in when he became king in January 1936 with Mrs. Wallis Simpson, an American socialite and divorcee who is still married to her second husband while having an affair with Edward, was scandalous by the standards of the time. Nevertheless, Edward was determined to marry her. But most members of the British political establishment were overwhelmingly opposed. Ultimately, Edward VIII would choose to abdicate rather than give up his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. On December 7, 1936, the king summoned Bertie to his house at Fort Belvedere and delivered the news that he had decided to abdicate the throne. Although Albert was aware that this was a possibility for some time, he was still devastated by the news. "I'm quite unprepared for it," he later confided to his wife. "David's been trained all his life. I'm only a naval officer. It's the only thing I know about." Though she was deeply worried for her husband and family, Elizabeth tried to comfort him. "We must take what is coming to us and make the best of it," she said. It is eminently clear that her eldest daughter inherited her legendarily stiff upper lip from her family. Less than a week after the abdication, when Bertie returned home from the Accession Council, Elizabeth and Margaret curtsied to their father. For the first time, their darling papa was now the king. Margaret asked her older sister, "Does this mean that you will be the queen one day?" Elizabeth replied gravely and quietly, "Yes, I suppose it does." "Poor you," Margaret said in commiseration. Elizabeth was now her father's heir presumptive. The family had to leave their home at 145 Piccadilly, though admittedly they were moving into the plusher surroundings of Buckingham Palace, the main royal palace in London. Bertie's transition to being King George VI, the regnal name he adopted, to establish continuity from his father, George V's reign, was stressful for the whole family. Bertie and Elizabeth now had far greater responsibilities and worries, and it became much more difficult for the family to find time to be together. Part of the problem was simply the sheer size of Buckingham Palace. "People here need bicycles," 10-year-old Lilibet observed when they first moved in, referring to those who had to travel between different parts of the palace grounds. Indeed, it was a substantially long walk from one end of the palace to the other, and the new king and queen, with their dramatically increased duties, had far less time to spend with their daughters in the nursery. They tried to compensate by spending as many full weekends and holidays as possible at Royal Lodge, where they could play games, picnic, and ride horses together as a family. But now that he was king, Bertie's work never really stopped. Even on the weekends, he only had a few hours to spend with his family before he inevitably had to get back to his daily red box of state papers. The immensity of Buckingham Palace made adjusting to their new home difficult in other ways as well. The kitchens were about a half-hour's walk from the rooms where the royal family actually dined, so the food was constantly served cold. Many rooms were chilly and damp, some with cracked walls. Some pieces of furniture were 100 years old, or more, and the palace had an aggravatingly persistent rodent infestation. Croffy was distinctly underwhelmed, not only by the condition of the palace, but also its lack of warmth. Life in a palace resembles camping in a museum. She later wrote, "There was also now a good deal less privacy for the family, who were shadowed constantly by detectives and bodyguards. Such is the lot of being a member of the royal family. No matter how attractive a prospect it might look from the outside." On May 12, 1937, Elizabeth attended her parents' coronation at Westminster Abbey and received her first intimation of what lay in store for her as queen one day. She sat with her sister Margaret and her grandmother Queen Mary and watched the proceedings, at first with fascination. Mindful of her position as his heir presumptive, Bertie tasked his eldest daughter with writing a detailed account of the coronation, which today rests in the royal archives. Elizabeth was impressed by the beauty, majesty, and seeming magic of the service, and she observed that the abbey itself seemed suspended in a haze of wonder. As the coronation ritual stretched on and on, however, she became impatient. Service got rather boring as it was all prayers, she later wrote. Anxious to know when it would be over, she quietly flipped through her program. She then discreetly nudged Queen Mary and pointed out the word finis, meaning the end in Latin, on the last page of her program, and she and her grandmother smiled conspiratorially at one another. The following year, Elizabeth began to attend private classes at Eton College with the Vice Provost, Sir Henry Martin. In order to prepare her for her future role as queen, she studied constitutional law and the history of the monarchy. Martin emphasized strongly that the secret of a successful monarchy is adaptability. He pointed to the ongoing collapse of ancient royal houses and asserted that the British monarchy had largely forestalled a similar fate by drawing back the curtain of mystery, allowing themselves to become more accessible to the public, and by being receptive to public opinion. This contrasted with France, where an aloof and largely uncaring royal establishment in the 18th century had been brought to a shuddering and ultimately bloody end with the French Revolution. By way of contrast, Elizabeth's grandfather, King George V, cognizant of the anti-German sentiment among the people during the First World War years, changed the royal family's name by proclamation in 1917 from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. While this did nothing to erase the king's heritage or make people forget the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm was, in fact, his first cousin, it was a powerful statement of King George V's identity as a British king, a leader and defender of his people. Another key aspect of Sir Henry Martin's instruction was his emphasis on the importance of broadcasting, which, since the reign of George V, has remained one of the primary means the royal family uses to connect with the public. From radio in George's time to television speeches, interviews, and in-depth documentary films in more recent decades. When their father ascended the throne, Elizabeth and Margaret were still very young, and because of their dramatic status change, they were now destined to live their lives in an even more rarefied atmosphere than the one into which they had been born. There was concern within the family that, in consequence, the girls might become even more isolated. Bertie's younger sister, Princess Mary, who was honorary president of the Girl Guides, suggested they might like to join a guide troupe. There were, of course, major issues with this proposal, similar to the ones that had prevented the princesses from attending school. How could their security be ensured without restricting their experience? Would they be accepted in a cooperative, egalitarian group like the Girl Guides in light of who they were? Would any accommodations to the princesses be viewed as preferential treatment? Finally, it was decided that a special troupe would be formed, consisting of relatives and the daughters of the aristocracy. Margaret, who is not yet old enough for the Girl Guides, was admitted to the troupe as a brownie. 20 girls roughly Elizabeth's age met regularly at Buckingham Palace beginning in 1937. They went on treks and explorations within the palace's extensive grounds, earned merit badges, and cooked sausages over an open fire. In later years, Elizabeth would speak warmly and nostalgically of her experience as a Girl Guide, and she continued to support the organization and its values throughout her long reign. During the summer of 1939, the King and Queen, accompanied by their daughters, paid a visit to the Royal Naval College. It was there that Elizabeth met Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark for the first time. Philip was her distant cousin and also a descendant of Queen Victoria. He had been named Best Cadet during his first year at Dartmouth. He was outgoing, funny, and already rather sophisticated at 18 years old. He received the King and Queen warmly and played with Elizabeth and Margaret. During their visit, Elizabeth admired his confidence and handsomeness a great deal. But she was just 13 and still had her braces on. It would be quite a few years before Philip would come to see her as a young woman rather than a child. Philip's uncle and closest male mentor, Louis Mountbatten, Bertie's cousin, was especially eager to encourage ongoing interactions between his nephew and the future queen, seemingly anxious to have some influence over the next generation of royals. Throughout 1938 and 1939, London began to transform in anticipation of a potential war with Germany as the Nazis became ever more aggressive in their pursuit of land. In Central Europe, annexing Austria first, then the Sudetenland, and finally Czechoslovakia. Anti-aircraft batteries were installed, bomb shelters were constructed, and gas masks were issued to tense and dismayed citizens. When war was finally declared in September 1939, Elizabeth and Margaret began to listen as closely to the wireless as the rest of the British public, hoping for good news. Croffey read them the newspapers daily, but she made efforts to edit out whatever she believed to be too shocking. Elizabeth, in turn, tried to shield Margaret from news and information about the war that she thought would upset her. Elizabeth was encouraged to try to continue as normal, but she was as eager to contribute to the war effort and do her bit in the unfolding crisis as were many young people of her generation. She and Margaret organized weekly sewing parties in their schoolroom. During the fall of 1939 and the spring of 1942 produced goods for the war effort. The King and Queen insisted that they and their daughters should follow the rationing requirements. Although they still enjoyed the privileges of having game from their own estate and fresh produce from the gardens. During the autumn of 1940, the princesses were secretly sent to live at Windsor Castle for the duration of the war, since it was the most well-defended royal residence. This was in keeping with government policy, which saw London emptied of the vast majority of its children and elderly people during the Blitz. The bombing campaign by the Germans between the autumn of 1940 and the early summer of 1941. Bertie and Elizabeth made an effort to spend as many weekends as possible at Windsor, but because they remained at Buckingham Palace for most of the week, it was a worrisome and confining adjustment for two young girls. There were blackout curtains at every window, lights were kept as low as possible, and a small group of carefully chosen soldiers stood guard, ready to take the princesses to an undisclosed safe house should an attack occur. The British media, as anxious as the government to protect the princesses, made no effort to uncover or expose their whereabouts. Newspapers reported only that they were safe and staying at an undisclosed location somewhere in the country. For 5 years, Elizabeth and Margaret tried to carry on as normal, attending to their lessons daily. But there were now all kinds of new and frightening realities to confront, including preparation for air raids. They tried to distract themselves by exploring the castle and playing hide and seek. The staff tried to keep them as occupied as possible and treated them kindly. They invited the princesses to tea parties with cakes and biscuits baked by the mothers and sisters of the guards. And the king's librarian took them down to the underground vaults of Windsor Castle to see the crown jewels. Knowing the Nazis' reputation for plundering cities like Vienna and Paris that they had conquered, these historic treasures had been hidden from potential invaders, along with innumerable other important artifacts and pieces of art from British museums and galleries. The British newspapers praised the fortitude of the princesses in their isolated life, noting that they obeyed rationing, kept their gas masks clean and near at hand, and planted a victory garden, in which they grew fresh vegetables for themselves. The Blitz began across southern England during the summer of 1940. Like the rest of the people of London, who found it near impossible to sleep during the bombings, Elizabeth and Margaret tried to stay calm during air raids. They would hurry down into the dungeons of Windsor Castle and try to distract themselves by reading, singing, or telling stories. By the end of the war, the Germans had dropped no less than 300 bombs around the Great Park of Windsor Castle, just a small fraction of the tens of thousands of bombs which rained down across England during the conflict. On October 13, 1940, 14-year-old Elizabeth gave her first public speech on the wireless during Children's Hour on the BBC, in which she offered comfort and encouragement to all of the children displaced by the war. The future queen stated, "We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace. And when peace comes, remember, it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say goodnight to you. Come on, Margaret." Then came Margaret's higher and unmistakable younger tone. "Good night, children." The broadcast was an international sensation, particularly in North America, where many British evacuees were sheltering. Hundreds of schools and churches throughout the United States and Canada installed wireless technology just to hear the princess's speech, and the BBC received numerous requests to repeat the broadcast. London may have been devastated by the Blitz, but Hitler had utterly failed to weaken British morale, and he then foolishly began to turn his attention to Russia. Believing that Britain would soon decide to negotiate peace terms with the Nazis, he was wrong. It was during the last few years of World War II that Elizabeth came of age and began to assert her independence. This assertion was more subtle in Elizabeth than in other young women. She was, overall, dutiful and eager to please her parents. But she nonetheless had her own convictions and a will of her own. Bertie and Elizabeth were not keen to see their daughter grow up too quickly. Above all, they wanted to forestall the moment when their family, us four, would be separated. From a public relations standpoint, both the royal establishment and the media continued to treat and portray Elizabeth as a child, even at age 16 or 17. Elizabeth might still be dressed in an outfit that matched Margaret's, who was over 4 years younger. Elizabeth also continued to live in the nursery wing and complete her lessons daily with Croffy. It was not until her 18th birthday that she was finally given her own suite of rooms. Outside of the nursery, in anticipation of her future role as queen, she was also made a counselor of state. Her parents began to give her more royal duties, including giving speeches at public functions and serving in charitable organizations. However, for Elizabeth, this was not enough. Having come of age in the midst of a calamitous war, she was, like many members of her generation, highly practical. She and Margaret had covertly and longingly watched debutante balls as children. But much as she had looked forward to a more traditional entry to adulthood, the current crisis was so much more important. Like others who grew up during the war, she was a strong believer in fairness and collective responsibility, and she yearned to play a greater part in the war effort. "I ought to do as other girls of my age do," she said. Many of her young aristocratic cousins were already doing their bit for the country, fighting in the field, caring for the sick and wounded in hospitals, and working in transportation or logistics. For the war effort, Elizabeth wanted to play her part also. So, when she turned 16 in April 1942, she promptly signed on at the labor exchange, but was not offered work. It is unclear why. Her status may well have been seen as a potentially problematic distraction, but the king's influence may also have played a part. Finally, a month before her 19th birthday, Elizabeth was permitted to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. Elizabeth's service in the ATS was viewed by many as highly effective propaganda and a morale booster for the British, but the princess's experience of service was very different. "It was the only time I had been able to test myself against people of the same age," she said later in March of 1945. Elizabeth began training as a driver and a mechanic. She worked hard and eventually became adept at the job, able to disassemble and reassemble an engine quickly and successfully. And yet, like her Girl Guide troop, a certain amount of authentic experience remained out of her reach. Normal interactions were made extraordinarily difficult simply because of who she was. Moreover, Bertie only finally allowed his daughter to enlist when he knew that the war would be over in mere weeks. With victory assured when the German campaign in the East against the Soviet Union had failed and new fronts were opened in Southern and Western Europe, Elizabeth was not the sort to confront or fight. But she had a quiet determination to assert her independence and to be her own person. This is most apparent in her choice to marry Prince Philip, which was probably the first decision she ever made without consulting her parents. While Elizabeth remained at Windsor Castle throughout the war, Philip's naval service took him to the Mediterranean and the Pacific. He continued to write to Elizabeth and visited the royal family several times throughout the duration of the war when he was on leave. Elizabeth seemed to fall more and more in love with him each time he visited. While Philip was flattered by the young princess's attention, he still mostly saw her as a child. Yet he was very fond of her, as he was fond of her whole family. Bertie, Elizabeth, and their daughters had a closeness that was very attractive to Philip, who had spent much of his childhood lonely and separated from his own family. He was invited to spend Christmas with the Windsors in 1943, and Elizabeth bustled excitedly around the nursery. "You know who's coming this Christmas, don't you, Croffy?" she asked happily. After another stay at the palace during the summer of 1944, Philip appeared to change his mind about Elizabeth. The two were very different people, but that was perhaps part of the attraction. He was sophisticated, opinionated, and often painfully irreverent, whereas she was innocent and demure. But she was also unfailingly faithful, dependable, and honest as few people in his life had been. And Elizabeth may have found Philip's tendency towards plain speaking refreshing. He certainly said and did things that Elizabeth could not, but perhaps sometimes wished to. Following Philip's visit, his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, known affectionately to the royal family as Dickie, promptly broached the subject of Philip's marriage to Elizabeth with the king and queen. Bertie and Elizabeth initially had numerous reservations about Philip, particularly regarding his temperament, his reputed way with women, his rebelliousness, and his family's partial German heritage. Additionally, they believed that Elizabeth, at 18, was still too young to be betrothed. Lord Mountbatten subsequently approached other courtiers and politicians to advocate for his nephew's suit. Elizabeth did not display any outward resentment that her parents were lukewarm about her relationship with Philip, but neither did she hide her feelings from her family or household. Croffy later wrote that the princess kept a picture of Prince Philip displayed in her sitting room. When Croffy inquired whether it was wise to do so, as anyone who saw it might begin to gossip and speculate, Elizabeth realized her governess was right and put the picture away, replacing it instead with a photograph of the prince with a thick and unruly beard. "There," she said, satisfied. "I defy anyone to recognize who that is." Victory in Europe Day on May 8, 1945, saw greater crowds in the streets of London than anyone had ever seen before. Multitudes stood outside Buckingham Palace, cheering and calling for the royal family to emerge onto the balcony. "We want the king," they chanted. Elizabeth stood with her parents, Margaret and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, proudly wearing her ATS uniform and waving to the cheering crowds. That evening, in a burst of high spirits, the royal family went out onto the streets of London to join the dancing and celebrating that seemed to be going on everywhere. Elizabeth and Margaret repeated their outing together the next night as well. "We walked for simply miles," Elizabeth wrote in her diary, "through Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly, Pall Mall." The two sisters, who had grown up so sheltered, joined their fellows before the gates of Buckingham Palace after midnight to cheer for their parents, the king and queen, who waved from the balcony. The evidence everywhere in London of the ravages of war was as heartbreaking to Elizabeth and Margaret as to the rest of the city. And yet they walked, cheered, sang, and danced with other young Londoners who, like the princesses, had shed their childhood in a time of war. Such was the sense of unification among the Second World War generation when what seemed then like the greatest struggle in history came to an end. By 1946, with the war over and England returning to some form of normality, Elizabeth had established a more adult routine. Each morning she was awakened by Bobo, now the princess dresser rather than her nanny, who helped her get ready for the day. She attended to her correspondence and her obligations to her various charities and attended royal council meetings. She now had her own independent household in Buckingham Palace, including her own receiving rooms for palace business, to ladies in waiting, a footman, and a huff-sous meh. She was also finally permitted to choose her own clothes and decided what fashions she preferred. The Depression and the war had had their impact on fashion. Rationing meant that each person was limited to one outfit per year, and the struggles of the times made ostentatious dress seem vulgar and disrespectful. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had taken care to dress her daughters respectably, but simply, and the public admired that she often made over some of her own garments to clothe the girls. Therefore, when Lilibet came of age, she unsurprisingly showed little interest in high fashion, and seemed to prefer an elegant but modest and traditional look. Besides, she was a country woman at heart and was much more comfortable in clothes that were functional. It is therefore ironic that, as queen, she would ultimately prove to be an international fashion icon. The unique outfits created by her personal staff were designed to be as distinctive and memorable as possible. Throughout her tenure as queen, she grew to appreciate the art and artistry of fashion and loved the bright colors and occasionally avant-garde ensembles that were chosen for her. These amazing outfits certainly made it difficult to lose the queen in a crowd. During a visit to Balmoral during the summer of 1946, Philip proposed to Elizabeth, and she accepted. Her father, the king, however, insisted they wait until after Elizabeth's 21st birthday, the following spring, to announce the engagement. Some historians speculate that this may have been a strategy to try and keep them apart long enough for one or both of them to lose interest. Perhaps Bertie was simply reluctant to let his beloved Lilibet go just yet. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth took their daughters with them on a state visit to South Africa in the spring of 1947. During this, Elizabeth was warmly and enthusiastically received by the crowds who came out to greet the royal family. April 21, 1947 was Elizabeth's 21st birthday. It was declared a national holiday and a great ball was held in her honor at Cape Town. Earlier that afternoon, she gave a historic speech which was broadcast all over the empire, composed by Sir Alan Lascelles. When Elizabeth first read it, tears reportedly filled her eyes. "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service, and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have the strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given.
I got it.
Help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it." The royal family returned to London early in the summer of 1947. Elizabeth and Philip's several months of separation had seemingly had no impact on their determination to marry. In the weeks following her return, she was often seen out and about with Philip in the passenger seat of his black MG sports car. On July 8th, they announced their engagement. The prospect of having a full-blown and public royal wedding was something of a public relations gamble during the immediate post-war period. On the one hand, it might bolster British morale at a time when rationing was still in force and the economy was still recovering from the long war effort. But conversely, the expense of a royal wedding could be perceived as totally out of touch with the difficult economic situation confronting the country. In the end, the British public seemed excited at the prospect of a royal wedding. Numerous ordinary citizens and well-wishers donated their clothing ration coupons to help produce the bride's wedding dress, which was designed by Norman Hartnell, in ivory satin with a 15-foot train, with the white roses of York painstakingly stitched in pearls. Prior to their wedding, Philip renounced his German surname and his Greek and Danish titles, becoming simply Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. King George VI then admitted Philip into the Order of the Garter, reserved for the closest and most trusted companions to the sovereign, and conferred on him the title of His Royal Highness, Duke of Edinburgh. On November 20th, 1947, Elizabeth and Philip were finally married with great celebration at Westminster Abbey. From all over the world, the couple received over 10,000 congratulatory telegrams and nearly 3,000 wedding gifts. 2,000 people attended a public reception just to see the couple's wedding gifts displayed. The next few years were happy and contented ones for Elizabeth and Philip. The king gifted them with the royal residence of Clarence House next to St. James Palace, and the newlyweds spent time renovating and improving it for themselves and their growing family. On November 14, 1948, just 6 days before their first wedding anniversary, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles. The following year, on August 15th, she and Philip were blessed again, this time with a daughter, Princess Anne. Beginning in 1948, Philip was stationed in Malta. And despite the birth of 2 children and her royal duties and responsibilities, Elizabeth tended to give priority to being at her husband's side during the early years of her marriage, even if her children remained in England. Charles took his first steps without either of his parents there to witness the milestone. Just as Elizabeth had spoken her first word with only Mrs. Knight, Bobo, and Ruby to tell the tale, Elizabeth made efforts to spend at least an hour with her children every morning and at least another hour between bath time and bedtime. When they did not accompany their parents abroad, Charles and Anne were left in the care of their nannies at Clarence House or stayed with their grandparents. The king and queen, when they went to Sandringham. While some have criticized Queen Elizabeth for this approach to motherhood, it is worth noting that her own mother and father had parented Elizabeth and Margaret in much the same way and still considered themselves a close family. In 1950, Marion Crawford published The Little Princesses to the shock and dismay of the entire royal family. Crawford had remained one of Lilibet's closest confidants. Even after her retirement as governess in 1947, Ms. Crawford had approached Queen Elizabeth for permission to publish the memoir, and the Queen had refused, horrified by the notion. The publication went ahead regardless and became an immediate bestseller, netting over £75,000. The Windsors felt utterly betrayed. They severed all ties with Ms. Crawford and never communicated with her again. From then on, the royal family would refer to anyone who wrote a royal memoir as doing a Crawford. By the standards of the modern Talal memoir, The Little Princesses is an overwhelmingly idealized, sentimental, and flattering portrait of 2 children Marion Crawford obviously loved dearly following her long years working with them. But in 1950, it seemed to be a gross and vulgar violation of the royal family's privacy and a betrayal of the trust they had placed in their children's beloved governess. Since then, the royal family has had many more people who have worked closely with them do a Crawford. Sharing human and relatable details about the royal family has become increasingly less objectionable over time. The royal family themselves have done so several times since the 1970s. Queen Elizabeth permitted the creation of 2 family documentaries, allowing camera crews and production staff into royal residences. Several biographies of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were published during their lifetimes, particularly so from the 1990s onwards. By 1951, it became clear that Elizabeth and Philip's rather carefree days as a married couple would be coming to an end sooner than expected. The health of King George VI was precarious. He had contracted lung cancer after years of chronic smoking, forcing his doctors to remove one of his lungs, and he suffered from various associated ailments. Elizabeth and Philip had to take on far more royal duties during the king's illness, and finally, Philip was forced to give up his naval career. In October, they departed for a royal tour of the United States and Canada on the king's behalf. In January of 1952, they undertook another major tour, the first stop on which was Kenya. Bertie saw his daughter and son-in-law off at the airport. It was the last time he would see Elizabeth. King George VI, known to his family as Bertie, died quietly in his sleep a week later. It was dawn in Nairobi, Kenya, and Elizabeth was up early, watching the sunrise at a lookout point at the famed Treetops Hotel. Speaking years later to a biographer, former royal equerry Mike Parker described a moment of peace and wonder that morning when a magnificent eagle appeared and hovered above them. "I never thought about it until later," he said, "but that was roughly the time when the king died." Elizabeth's private secretary, Martin Chartres, heard the news about the king's death at a local hotel. He quickly telephoned Mike Parker at Saginaw Lodge, where Elizabeth and Philip were staying, and asked him to inform the new queen of what had happened. Parker, who couldn't bear to tell her, asked Philip to speak to her instead. Philip took his wife into the garden to give her the terrible news. Elizabeth appeared to pace up and down the garden agitatedly, but when she came back inside, she was calm. She apologized to her staff for the lack of notice, but said they would have to leave as soon as possible. By the time Chartres arrived, her face was flushed, but she was otherwise composed, writing letters of apology for the abrupt end to the tour and the necessity of canceling multiple engagements. Before they departed, Chartres asked her what regnal name she would choose. Sovereigns often choose a name that shows continuity with the past or reverence for a certain line of rulers. Elizabeth preferred to keep things simpler. When asked what her regnal name would be, she replied, "My own name. Elizabeth, of course. What else?" 'Twas a fitting beginning to the straightforward, no-nonsense reign of Queen Elizabeth II. When Elizabeth returned to London in February 1952, her grandmother, Queen Mary, promptly paid her a visit at Clarence House, insisting that she, her old granny and subject, must be the first to kiss her hand. Elizabeth was shocked and deeply affected by the reverence, and it brought home the reality of her new position to her even more forcefully. The next morning, she addressed the Accession Council at St. James Palace, affirming in her speech her desire to serve dutifully. When her father had been crowned king, he had been hailed as both king and emperor. But in light of the ongoing collapse of Britain's colonial empire, his daughter was styled Queen of the United Kingdom, the head of the Commonwealth, and queen of her other realms and territories. This distinction is not necessarily immediately apparent, but it was an important one, signifying that the British monarch was no longer the ruler of an empire, but an honorary queen of individual dominions which would each have the right to decide their own degree of affiliation and commitment to the Commonwealth. A little over a year later, on June 2, 1953, Elizabeth's coronation was held in Westminster Abbey, in a notable break with precedent. It was the first time that a coronation for a British sovereign had ever been broadcast live. Officials had reacted with horror in previous decades to the notion of allowing full public consumption of such momentous events in Westminster Abbey. A live broadcast had been suggested for the coronation of King VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1937, but the Archbishop of Canterbury had hotly rejected the proposition, claiming that ordinary people could not be trusted to show the proper reverence. The Archbishop was particularly disturbed at the idea that people might be able to listen to the sacred service while drinking in their local pub and with their hats on. The Duke of Edinburgh, who chaired the planning committee, was strongly in favor of televising the coronation, making the monarch more accessible to the people in a modern way. The committee finally agreed, but insisted that the camera pan away from the ceremony during the anointing and communion. Elizabeth wore an exquisite ivory satin gown, which, according to her instructions, was minutely embroidered with the floral emblems of every country in the Commonwealth. After taking the coronation oath, she was anointed, invested with regalia, and crowned 2 cheers of "God Save the Queen." The crowds outside the Abbey erupted in celebration, and millions of people across Britain who were watching the event on television cheered along with them. Thousands of households and businesses had purchased or rented television sets just to see the coronation. From the point that she ascended the throne in 1952, The central challenge of Queen Elizabeth's life was to keep personal and family life firmly compartmentalized from her life and duty as the monarch. Unfortunately, this proved to be an immensely difficult goal to achieve and was no doubt the cause of great pain and regret to her over the years. Because her duty as queen had to always come first. Because of her unique position, she could rarely express her opinions for fear of potentially sparking a constitutional crisis. She had to be endlessly diplomatic. During the decades following her accession, the monarchy faced successive challenges, including public interrogations of its cost to taxpayers and questions about its real utility in the modern world. In addition, public fascination with scandals within the personal lives of the royal family threatened to undermine their legitimacy. The late queen was often praised for the manner in which she approached these crises, with her first priority being her position as head of state of the Church and the Commonwealth. Others criticized her approach to her family's personal struggles and asserted that she could have been a better mother to her children or a better sister to Margaret, even if that meant potentially compromising her duty as queen after her sister's coronation. Princess Margaret was waiting for her carriage in front of the Abbey when a photographer noticed her picking a piece of lint off a man's jacket, that of her father's equerry, Group Captain Peter Townsend. Before long, speculation about their relationship developed into a media frenzy. Elizabeth was reportedly sympathetic to her sister's situation and wished for her to be happy. She had never liked taking sides, so she did not initially encourage or discourage Margaret in her relationship with Townsend. Unfortunately, Townsend was divorced and his wife was still living, and therefore the Anglican Church would not consent to marry them. Moreover, Margaret was third in line to the throne, and the shadow of the abdication still loomed large in the early post-war period. The royal family and those who worked most closely with them asked the couple to delay a formal engagement, perhaps hoping that their feelings for one another would wane. Sadly, they did not, and rather than forfeit her title, her income, or be forced to live abroad, Margaret and Peter mutually called off their engagement. Several years later, Princess Margaret married the photographer, Anthony Armstrong Jones, with whom she had 2 children, Sarah and David. The couple divorced in 1976. Things were chilly, not only between the Queen and her sister in the early years of her reign, but seemingly between herself and her husband also. Philip had not adjusted well to being the husband of the Queen of England. Having to give up his naval career had been a bitter disappointment, and he found the endless round of royal duties of ribbon-cutting, handshaking, and speech-making extraordinarily tiresome. He was accustomed to a much more active life, and it was difficult for him to adjust to being a supporting act for the Queen. By 1957, American newspapers began to gossip about Philip and the supposedly questionable company he kept at the Thursday Club, a men's lunch club featuring a who's who of politics, finance, and the arts in Soho. Rumors of indiscreet behavior by Philip and those accompanying him on the 1957 royal tour began to spread also. The palace denied the rumors. Eventually, Philip did manage to carve out a niche for himself and settle into his royal duties. An endlessly curious and adventurous man, he remained particularly interested in being a patron for science, technology, sports, and education initiatives. In 1957, Elizabeth made him a Prince of the United Kingdom through letters patent to thank him for his service to the Crown and the Commonwealth. He was not given the title of King Consort or Prince Consort due to overwhelming political opposition. Elizabeth's position as a female monarch was by no means unprecedented, but it was still a delicate one, especially in light of her wedding vows to love, honor, and obey her husband, which was still the conventional wording in the middle of the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip eventually developed into a cohesive and effective team, and she described him on multiple occasions during their lifetimes as her strength and stay. The decades they faced together certainly did call for both strength and stability. The royal couple welcomed 2 more children in the next few years. Prince Andrew was born on February 19, 1960, and Prince Edward 4 years later, on March 10, 1964. Prince Philip was firm in his insistence that their children be permitted to go to senior school with ordinary young people. Charles, Andrew, and Edward attended their father's alma mater, Gordonstown in Scotland, and attended Benenden School in Kent. They grew up nowhere near as sheltered as their mother had, and as a result, grew into more worldly young adults than Elizabeth had been when she first entered her adult years. There has been a great deal of disagreement among observers and biographers about the Queen's performance as a mother. Charles collaborated in a biographical publication during the early 1990s, which sometimes painted Elizabeth as cold and distant, and at other times affectionate, but not enough inclined to interfere when she should. The impression was given that, as a result, her children were all rather lost. Some biographers disagree with this perspective, pointing out that Elizabeth, despite the rigors of her position, spent as much, if not more, time with her children than most of the aristocratic women of her acquaintance. Speaking to a royal biographer in the early 2000s, all that Prince Philip would say for the record was, "We did our best." The 1960s saw the beginning of an unprecedented increase in criticism and satire directed at the monarchy. Only a few years earlier, making fun of members of Parliament or the royal family in public would have been viewed as shamefully disrespectful. But by the 60s, British comedians regularly began to poke fun at their political elites, especially comedians with Republican or progressive leanings. And British newspapers were far less reticent about publishing items injurious to their authority. Figures in 1969. Prince Philip gave an interview on American television lamenting the financial situation of the royal family. His references to the exorbitantly expensive upkeep of palaces and yachts fell flat and were perceived as totally out of touch in a Britain which still had not achieved a full economic recovery from the Second World War. Commentators began to look much more closely at the royal family's income from the civil list payments and the cost to the taxpayer. There was increased scrutiny of the fact that the Queen paid no estate or income tax and was not required to disclose any details about her private fortune or finances. At the time, the Queen's personal fortune was probably not more than £12 million. Her personal fortune, however, grew much greater. She inherited approximately £70 million from the Queen Mother's estate in 2002. But what her total net worth was is difficult to calculate because many royal resources such as residences, artifacts, and regalia actually belong to the nation. In the early 1990s, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip announced that they would begin paying taxes on their personal income. In the 1970s, the royal family began to work with younger and more modern press officials, and new innovations were introduced to increase public accessibility to the monarchy. The Royal Walkabout was first introduced during a royal visit to Australia, during which the Queen undertook a street visit that was not on the official itinerary to meet people, shake hands with them, and chat a little. The public responded warmly and positively to the practice, and it became a permanent and regular event during royal visits all over the world. In 1977, Queen Elizabeth marked 25 years on the throne with her Silver Jubilee celebrations. The City of London hosted more than 6,000 street parties. The Queen's popularity had remained consistently high despite greater expectations of accountability from the public. The Queen made a very successful visit to Northern Ireland, which was encouraging considering the region had been embroiled in sectarian conflict since the late 1960s. But the Northern Ireland troubles struck much closer to home during the next few years and were the first in a fairly rapid succession of dangerous incidents that put the safety of the royal family and those who served them at risk. In 1979, Lord Mountbatten and his grandson were killed in a bombing in Ireland, for which the IRA, said the Irish Republican Army, claimed responsibility. Similarly deadly attacks were carried out on several of the Queen's household cavalry and military musicians at Hyde Park in London in 1982. At the annual trooping of the colour ceremony celebrating the Queen's birthday in 1981, 17-year-old Marcus Sargent fired 6 shots at the Queen, which thankfully turned out to be blanks. Mounted side saddle on her horse Burmese, Elizabeth was startled, but she recovered quickly enough to effectively soothe her horse. And the public admired her grace under pressure. Only months later, on a visit to Dunedin, New Zealand, 17-year-old Christopher Lewis tried to shoot the Queen with a rifle from the 5th floor of a building overlooking a parade in her honor. Thankfully, he missed. Both of these would-be assassins faced charges and jail time. The security of Buckingham Palace itself was called into question in July of 1982 when it was revealed that a man named Michael Fagan had somehow managed, without any sort of special equipment or ability, to breach the palace's defenses, travel through the corridors unseen, and then walk right into the Queen's bedroom. Multiple and differing accounts of this event exist, so exactly what happened is still somewhat unclear. But apparently, Fagan simply walked in and opened the Queen's curtains. Startled by the intruder, she reportedly pressed the button next to her bed to summon her staff, but the bell was either broken or simply went unheard. It seems she managed to slip out of the bedroom while Fagan was looking around for a cigarette lighter. There was fascinated speculation that the two might have even had a conversation, as some believed that Fagan had been in the Queen's bedroom for as long as 10 minutes. Fagan, however, speaking to several newspapers years later, denied that they discussed anything, stating that the Queen had simply run out of the room at the first opportunity. Such threats to her safety were a reality that Queen Elizabeth had to face quite frequently throughout her life, but commendably, it did not curb her willingness to remain accessible to the public. She continued to perform her royal duties very much in the open. Protecting the Queen during her walkabouts, for example, was ultimately very difficult, but Elizabeth refused to be intimidated. She was also determined to preserve a sphere of privacy and comfort for herself and her family, and traditionally opposed measures that threatened to violate it. Queen Elizabeth worked with no fewer than 14 prime ministers. But the Thatcher years were particularly interesting for her from a political standpoint. Margaret Thatcher was not just Britain's first female prime minister, but she was also the first Elizabeth had worked with who was her own age. One might imagine that this political relationship would have been among the Queen's most harmonious and successful. But multiple biographers and historians believe that it was not. The Queen was far too devoted to constitutional norms ever to break the confidentiality of her weekly meetings with Britain's top elected official, or to criticize a prime minister openly, which she never did. Historians speculate that the strongest division between the two women may have emerged over Thatcher's reluctance to approve the recommendation of sanctions against South Africa to encourage the abolition of apartheid, to which the Queen was deeply committed. According to former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Queen Elizabeth was highly active behind the scenes in encouraging international support for an end to the oppressive apartheid government in South Africa. Despite the numerous challenges she had faced as both a mother and a queen, these challenges reached something of a crescendo during the 1990s. A new decade had brought increased criticism of the younger members of the royal family, and the Queen was increasingly satirized in television programs. True to form, she attempted to fight fire with fire by making another documentary film, Elizabeth Art 4, for which she allowed cameras to follow her about for nearly a year while she provided the commentary. The film premiered in 1992. It's the same year which the Queen once dubbed in a famous speech at London's Guildhall her annus horribilis, or horrible year. The reasons for her lamenting 1992 are all too well known. The marriages of 3 out of 4 of her children fell apart in 1992, and a disastrous fire at Windsor Castle caused £60 million in damages to her childhood home in March of the following year. The Queen's former nanny, Margaret Bobo MacDonald, her confidant and closest friend, passed away at the age of 8. She had been by Elizabeth's side for 67 years, continuing to serve as her dresser when the young princess moved out of her nursery. Elizabeth was deeply saddened by Bobo's passing. Yet another terrible blow struck the royal family in 1997, when Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris. At the time of the accident, Elizabeth and Philip were at Balmoral with Charles and Diana's sons, William and Harry, to whom they now had to explain the terrible reality of their mother's death. The nation and many more people around the world mourned Diana's passing. She had been widely popular and much beloved for her philanthropy and empathetic kindness, and an impromptu shrine consisting of thousands of cards, flowers, and tokens of sympathy accumulated in front of Buckingham Palace in the following days. The newspapers began to question why there was no flag flying at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, why the Queen had not addressed the nation, and why the royal family did not seem to be mourning Diana's death with any visibility. There was a fundamental disconnect at work here. What the public wanted was a show of emotion. What the Queen wanted was to protect her devastated grandsons and allow them and the rest of the family to mourn privately. But because Diana's separation from the royal family had been so acrimonious, the Queen understood that something more was required to validate the very genuine public mourning. Elizabeth acquiesced, returning to London and giving a live broadcast the day before Diana's funeral, expressing her admiration for her daughter-in-law and the family's grief at her passing. Public approval of the Queen reached its lowest point in 1997, but soon rebounded significantly. Elizabeth confronted two more terrible losses in 2002. In February, her sister Margaret passed away at the age of 71, and the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, died just 1 month later. At the impressive age of 101, Elizabeth was broken-hearted. As a family, she, Margaret, and their mother had lost Bertie far too soon. But the three women had remained an exceptionally close family unit for half a century thereafter, one upon which the Queen had always relied for advice and comfort during her many decades as sovereign. During the same year, the Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee and 50 years on the throne. Even as she mourned her mother and sister, she reaffirmed the vow of service she had made half a century before. "I am driven by my resolve to continue with the support of my family, to serve the people of this great nation of ours to the best of my ability, through the changing times ahead." Indeed, times were certainly changing with regard to what was acceptable within the royal family. In 2005, she gave her blessing for Prince Charles to marry his longtime love, Camilla Parker Bowles, who was subsequently made Duchess of Cornwall. Because both Charles and Camilla were divorced, the couple were married in a civil service, and the Queen and Prince Philip did not attend the ceremony, but they happily attended the reception. As sovereign, Elizabeth was mindful of her position as head of the church, but she understood that times truly had changed considerably during her reign. Few people now expect that members of the royal family should marry anyone other than whom they choose, in a move that speaks even more strongly about letting go of the past before she died. The Queen expressed her wish that the Duchess be given the title of Queen Consort at Prince Charles' coronation. This represents a major departure from the traditional approach to marriage and divorce within the royal family, especially in light of their longtime affair and Camilla's involvement in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. In 2012, the Queen reached the zenith of her popularity with incredible approval ratings approaching 90%. That year, she became the only British monarch besides Queen Victoria to celebrate a Diamond Jubilee and to a riotous reception. She opened the Olympic Games in London with a very special James Bond-themed performance with Daniel Craig, during which she hilariously appeared to parachute out of a plane into the Olympic Stadium. The royal family has seen a re-emergence of criticism and scrutiny during the last decade, some of it surrounding the departure of Elizabeth's grandson, Prince Harry, and his wife, Meghan Markle, from their royal roles, their seeming estrangement from the royal family, and the much-discussed exclusive interview they gave to Oprah Winfrey. In March of 2021, public attention was also drawn to the royal finances with the release of the Paradise Papers. In 2017, it was reported that a sizable proportion of the Queen's wealth from the Duchy of Lancaster rests in offshore tax havens. Different estimates exist of what Her Majesty's net worth was, but it was generally reckoned to be between £500 million and £600. 0. Perhaps most troubling of all, to royal supporters and critics. Alike in more recent years are Prince Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and the lawsuit for sexual assault launched against him by Virginia Giuffre, which he settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. In January 2022, just months before her death, the Queen stripped her son Prince Andrew of his military titles, as well as all royal duties and patronages, none of which will be returned. In the announcement, it was added that Andrew would face the lawsuit as a private citizen, without the support of his family, despite the reoccurrence of scandal and criticism for members of the royal family, which grieved the Queen in the last years of her life. She remained highly popular, both in the United Kingdom and abroad. People all over the world often wrote to her to express their admiration and to express sympathy for her various family dramas. An example of public understanding which she appreciated. Even at the lowest point of her popularity in 1997, she still had a 70 to 75% approval rating in the UK, as well as in the Old Dominions of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. These are polling results that must be the envy of elected politicians everywhere, and are quite impressive considering the length of her tenure as Queen. In 2002, opinion was fairly unanimous among the people of the UK and Britons. Old Dominions, they strongly agreed that the Queen had done a good job as head of state and head of the Commonwealth, but a small majority did not believe that the monarchy would long outlast her. That opinion has not changed much in the last 2 decades, with many people remaining skeptical about the potential success or stability of a monarch other than Queen Elizabeth. Inevitably, the most basic question most people have about the Queen is simply, what was she really like? Philip said that his wife's greatest virtue was her tolerance. He described her as careful, observant, disciplined, and highly moral, but rarely judgmental. Her Majesty's dresser for nearly 30 years. Angela Kelly wrote of the Queen's courage, kindness, strength, sense of humor, and sense of fun. She apparently had a notable talent for putting people at ease and was a master at helping those who were a little odd in her presence to relax with a little pleasant small talk. Being the fashion icon that she was, the Queen grew to appreciate beautiful clothes as much as anyone, but she was always most comfortable in riding clothes, practical outdoor shoes or boots, and one of her signature headscarves. The photographs and footage in which Elizabeth appeared to be the most excited, animated, and happy were when she was spending time with her dogs and horses, riding or watching horse racing. From the late 1960s onwards, Elizabeth enjoyed pursuing a career breeding and racing horses. She also loved spending time with her family, which has continued to grow following her passing to 8 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren. However, she experienced an increasingly solitary time towards the end of her life, following the death of her husband, Prince Philip. In 2021, indeed, one of the most poignant images of the Queen in the last years of her reign was her sitting alone in mourning for her dear husband, Prince Philip, due to COVID restrictions that were in force at the time, in the pews at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Even though that was arguably the very worst moment of her life, considering the esteem and affection she had for him, the Queen always placed duty above her personal needs. Unlike many of Britain's politicians, she led by example during the COVID pandemic in the last few years of her life. She passed along the bulk of her royal duties to Charles, Camilla, her grandson William, and his wife, Catherine Middleton. Queen Elizabeth still cherished her position and duty as head of state and head of the Commonwealth. She would never have abdicated. "It's a job for life," she once remarked. "It's a question of maturing into something that one's got used to doing and accepting the fact that it's your fate." Because I think continuity is very important. Some political commentators today are quick to dismiss the monarchy as outdated, needlessly sentimental, and a waste of resources. But others have argued that few, if any, elected politicians could ever hope to exercise the level of soft power that was at the core of the Queen's influence. Soft power refers to the ability to produce desired outcomes using gentle persuasion rather than compulsion or force. Elizabeth's embodied British history. She provided a concrete link to her nation's past in the modern world. Further, the Commonwealth continues to play an important role for those countries that choose to belong to it. The association provides access to numerous resources for the further development and betterment of all member nations. And it is through these international partnerships that the Queen was able to concentrate some of her soft power. Commonwealth countries not only share resources and strategies for development, but also cultural, political, and judicial sensibilities. The Commonwealth is one type of tool for preserving international cooperation and friendship, and for the continued promotion of the rule of law, democratic institutions, and both civil and human rights. Elizabeth's reign witnessed a complete redefinition of both monarchy and empire. And in a fascinating paradox, the monarchy became, in many ways, more influential the more its actual power declined. The most popular members of the royal family in the 21st century function as super ambassadors, politicians and diplomats who might refuse to deal with elected British. Officials invariably jumped at the chance to meet the Queen, who was called upon many times to encourage political accord by holding a royal event or visit. She left an immense legacy both to the British people and to the wider world, guiding Britain through greater social, political, economic, and technological change than perhaps any monarch in history. She also provided leadership, comfort, perspective, stability, and a willingness to make change whatever her people required of her within constitutional limits. But beyond this, Elizabeth was also a touchstone of global decolonization. Countries and peoples with a painful history of British occupation and colonization came to associate her with the gradual withdrawal from empire, the end of oppression, the beginning of independence and self-governance, and the beginning of international friendship on equal terms. It is worth noting that more than half of Britain's former colonies remain members of the Commonwealth today, and most of those who chose to withdraw still maintain good relations with the UK and have largely favorable approval ratings for the monarchy. All good things come to an end. When Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee was celebrated in February 2022, it was done so with the awareness that it would almost certainly be the last major anniversary of the Queen's accession all the way back in 1952. As by the time the event was held in 2022, she was 95 years of age. As a result, Elizabeth was largely confined to balcony appearances at Buckingham Palace during the event. In the months that followed, her health declined precipitously, not least perhaps because of the loss of her soulmate and much-loved husband, Prince Philip. At this time, Prince Charles and other working royals were increasingly called upon to fill in for her at events. As such, it was perhaps not surprising when the news was released in early September 2022 that the Queen was very ill at her favorite residence, Balmoral in Scotland. In the end, she died faster than many had expected, though Charles and Anne were by her side when she passed on the afternoon of September 8th. At 96 years of age, her state funeral was particularly long to accommodate the long lines of people who wished to file by her body as it lay in state at Westminster Abbey throughout mid-September. Finally, on September 19th, after a private family ceremony, Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle next to her parents and husband, as is the custom with royal succession. Prince Charles succeeded his mother immediately upon her death, becoming King Charles III. He was 73 when he succeeded to the throne in September 2022, making him the oldest person to become monarch of Britain. In line with his mother's wishes, Charles' second wife, Camilla, became his queen consort at his coronation at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 2023. It was a remarkable occasion in the history of modern Britain, as it was the first royal coronation in over 70 years and only the sixth coronation in the last 200 years. So what kind of monarch will Charles be? His task is not as arduous as it once would have been. If Elizabeth had only lived into her 70s and Charles had become king in the late 1990s or early 2000s, it would have been problematic. given that he was, somewhat unfairly, depicted in many circles as the villain in the demise of his marriage to Princess Diana, and public opinion towards the Prince of Wales was very low following Diana's death in 1997. However, with the passage of time, people have warmed again to Charles, and his coronation was warmly greeted. His style of kingship will be different from that of his mother. He believes in a slimmed-down monarchy and will reduce the size of the royal establishment, while he will also try to champion causes that are closer to his heart to a greater extent than Elizabeth did, notably his lifelong advocacy of environmentalism. Charles has been concerned with climate change for decades, and as such, he ascended the throne at just the right moment to be able to champion this cause. Whatever kind of king he is, it will be different from his late mother. It will be a tough act to follow.